Hello and welcome back to Week in Review with the one and only Doovid. I'm your host, Jen, Church of Entropy. Happy to be here this Sunday evening. Over to you, Doovid, for the introductions. Thank you so much once again for paying for the Consciousness Conference that we both attended this weekend and for putting together the newsletter. Looking forward to going through all that on the show this evening. Over to you. And Doovid, you are still muted.
Oh yeah, great. Good to be back. Thanks for putting this together, Jennifer. Hopefully, some people caught our post streams on the Science of Consciousness conference. If anyone was attended that and tuning in, welcome. Uh, you know, possibly come on. We talk more about that. Certainly, one of the directions that I'm hoping to go. So let me go straight into some random links for the week in review. If you have do the screen share for me.
Yeah, I just realized I had it up before and it disappeared. So let me just get that going again.
Okay, yeah, and I think I wrote a paper this week, 1,500 words on the Science of Consciousness conference. I thought it was actually one of my better one. I actually showed to my mom and had her look at it. There was only a few minor errors that she corrected, and I'm going to give it to my dad actually to read. I think it was pretty good. Maybe if there's time, even I'll read. I'll read it out. So
Yeah, OBS gets stuck sometimes. I just had to resend it. So it looks like you are good to go, but I think I'm presenting the wrong window. So let me just switch that over.
okay, so randomly I saw Keith Woods wrote did a stream on fine tuning God in the multiverse because he's not a scientist, but he was rambling a little bit on the philosophical implications. Maybe a sign of panpsychism, just that it's panpsychism. The thoughts are in the air. So here's my essay this week on the Science of Consciousness conference. Maybe we'll take a look. I'll leave that one up. Random, a new survey in Israel. God forbid, half of Israelis fear that there's going to be another Holocaust. God forbid, slightly higher, more than 55% of women and 42% of men are scared that, God forbid. So, we probably won't talk about that, but I just thought that was random on psychology or nature of Judaism, like Adam Green type stuff. Um, I think next week I'm going to write my essay on cognitive dissonance. So one of the things related to the Science of Consciousness conference is the huge need to understand brain anatomy, because the neural correlates is almost all based on brain anatomy. Um, Everything that we know to understand the nature of the neural correlates of consciousness requires quite a bit of brain anatomy. So I reviewed this myself. This is like a quick one of 18 lectures from Khan Academy, mostly less than 10 minutes. So if people are interested, just a quick review on brain anatomy. I was watching these earlier today. I finished the first 9. Here's like a full college course on the nervous system, neurophysiology, 60 lectures, like half an hour to an hour. So if people really want to understand neuroanatomy and specifically neurophysiology, hopefully some people will check that out. University of Michigan, a Saturday morning physics lecture on dark matter and muon to electron conversion. It's a link Jennifer shared. I actually didn't have time to watch it yet. I probably won't be able to watch it, but I'm pretty familiar with the subject. on 10 ways to manipulate a narcissist. If she wanted to talk about that, if she knew the ways. I know quite a bit about narcissism. I have a few books on it. People, I deal with a lot of narcissists, and so next week I'm probably going to do my essay on cognitive dissonance. Here was a review video of the Penrose Peterson interview. I never heard of these guys, Matthew Ferris and Gavin Wentz. I didn't have time to watch it. I probably won't. I'm not sure. Did you check that out?
No.
Okay, here was an Israeli um, uh, near the Hav. I'm not sure if I shared him before. He presented at the conference and shared on his YouTube page the relativistic theory of consciousness. There's really almost no reporting on it. And this other man, Muhammad Ali Tahiri, I guess he's got a whole series of researchers. And so he posted his group of people in their presentations at the Science of Consciousness conference. I don't think I saw any of these. Maybe these were like booths or something, stuff that they didn't share. So I just looked up on Wikipedia. I guess he's an Iranian dissident that fled to America, and he's got spiritual Sufi interpretations of Islam that brought him problems in Iran, and he was imprisoned, and then there was efforts to get him out, and they came to America. Um, he's got his own theories on consciousness, but it was unclear. You could see, but he was the only one that posted, and it was his group of students that lectured. I mentioned the other week Henry Panquier. I guess Macron won the French elections. I thought if Le Pen maybe won, we'd bring. I'd ask Samish if he was around, wanted to talk about it, but Macron won by a pretty large margin. But the Panquier Institute in France had um, a symposium on mathematical models in ecology and evolution. And I'm not going to have time to watch those. There's quite a few. I have so much other stuff taking my time. But if that's interesting, please check it out and report back to us. Here, just related, this was in. So here is I guess a freeware copy. It's already like 40 years old of Stuart Hamerov's 1987 Ultimate Computing, Biomolecular Consciousness and Nanotechnologies, where he publishes his findings about microtubules and other stuff. He actually has a chapter on like viruses and nanotechnology, and talks about the possibility of bioweapons. If people want to check out and know more about, so it's even too big to. The Ultimate Computing is the 1987 book. So I saw he mentioned anesthesiology and John Snow's 5 stages of consciousness for anesthesiology. I'm thinking like the 1840s. And did you know the name John Snow?
Doesn't ring any bells. I don't think so.
He's most famous for the. I mean, he's a British, like they call him the father of epidemiology, and with COVID-19, he became a little bit more popular, and the 1854 Broad Street chloria outbreak, where there were a substantial amount of people dying in a suburb of London, and he deduced that its cause was a specific water faucet, and uh, and then demonstrated that it was in fact this water faucet that was the cause of the spread of chloria, and is considered the father of epidemiology. However, he was anesthesiologist by profession, and his stages of anesthesiology was later codified by Arthur Ernest Goodall, where he talks about he takes it down to four stages, um, where like the first stage would be the beginning of the induction of the general anesthesia to loss of consciousness. Jennifer was noting that they back then he called it ether, that the anesthetic was called ether. But first stage is a general loss of consciousness. Second stage would be loss of consciousness to onset of automatic breathing. So once the anesthesia kicks in, that the person, so to say, will unconsciously resume body functions, and God forbid it might be the same as someone in a coma or something, or you could have machine induced. But what does it mean, unconscious and related to body function? And I guess the stages were related to disaster. Stage three would be paralysis, and four could be death. But I just thought that was interesting that the father of anesthesiology, John Snow, is also the father of epidemiology, if people are familiar. So Nick's in the chat. I'm about to do some music also. Here was this essay. I think there was an article in The Atlantic about, God forbid, this libs of TikTok doxing a woman that was, like doxing people, and then she got doxed. And so someone wrote, uh, a research paper on doxing privacy and gendered harassment from like a feminist perspective, and the effect doxing has on women, and goes into like a history of the so-called doxing and the law. So people are more want a more academic approach. That was pretty big in the news. I'm not, like a lot of people were covering the libs of TikTok. I'm not even sure I'd ever even seen libs of TikTok, but
It sounds like
yeah,
something you'd see in an excursion between Dante and Virgil.
yeah, I mean, I can't say that. I mean, it's one of these like, the warnings of like my complaint against Ralph, where it's like the warnings of the degeneration of society by sharing degeneracy. It's like, no, I'm not degenerate. I'm just warning you about the degeneration of society by constantly putting in your face videos about the degeneration of society.
And then laughing like a baboon.
So memes of destruction. I guess this woman has a popular YouTube channel talking about science fiction and comic books, and she's making fun of memes, and he shared it on her thing. I sell science fiction, so props to memes if he pops up in the chat. I'm not sure who this woman is. I saw her most popular thing was like a weekly review of Game of Thrones, but she's making fun of memes there. And I don't know if she's got like some kind of LARP of being a vampire or whatever, but I saw memes shared that. Rick Beato just watched this right before the show, was talking about why Generation Z doesn't care about music, and he was talking about video games. And I think he missed the important point that Kevin Michael Grace used to mention, which is um, interaction. That it's not just that video games have ruined taken over entertainment. It's that interactive features that people want things to be interactive, like live streaming, recording and posting videos versus live. And video games even today are interactive, and music's not interactive. And so it's probably partially the why music is just less popular in general, and even playing music or various things like that, because computer technology allows you to um, create interactive experiences. So that would that I heard from Kevin Michael Grace. So oops, closed the wrong window. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick chant this week, back on the theme of the degeneration of society from the hero's journey to the loser's journey. and I found a really good song that I used to kind of like this song. It's still a pretty popular song that 1979 that I think demonstrates this concept of the hero to the loser's journey, and the song itself kind of makes a note of that. Are you familiar with this song, Styx, uh, Renegade?
Sounds familiar. I'd need to hear it again though. Does it have a lot of
Yeah.
screeching in it?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's got like men doing like high pitched singing, and you'll probably recognize it when I start it. Um, Here is the lead singer. I guess the band broke up already. That like the song is 79. They had another famous song, "Come Sail Away," but I guess the pinnacle of rock bands is like later you have your song played with the orchestra acoustic classical backdrop. So this one I actually found the sheet music on. So if we got Nick in the chat, I've been mentioning the hero's journey. My first essay was on the musical structure, and so it starts out with this acoustically the "Oh mama, I'm in fear from my life from the long arm of the law. Lawman has put an end to my running, and I'm so far from my home." And then it has like a chorus with actually a alto, tenor, and soprano. "Oh, mama, I can hear you a crying, so scared and all alone. Hangman is coming down from the gallows, and I don't have very long. The jig is up, the news is out, they finally found me, the renegade who had it made. Retrieve for a bounty, never more to go astray. There will be the end today of the wanted man." So did that sound familiar at all to you?
Not really.
So this was their theme song. I don't know if people in the chat, yeah, Don Willis knows Tommy Shaw. Um, Sticks, like not a really big band, but that was their most famous song. And when they did live performances, that would be the their final piece, and like you get the whole audience singing. And the song has this interesting structure where it starts out with just the voice at the beginning. "Oh mama, I'm in fear," and then the music starts coming in on the "Hangman is coming down from the gallows, and I don't have very long," and then the full music kicks in where the jig is up, the news is out, they finally found me, the renegade who had it made, retreat for a bounty. And musically it has a solo, and this would be more pure music theory because it's not vocal, but they take it up a notch till the solo, and then they go back to just voice, and they sing like really like high pitched men wailing back in the solo. And I guess if they did this live, the "Oh mama, I'm in fear from my life from the long arm of the law. Lawman has put an end to my running, and I'm so far from my home." But musically, it has the straight hero's journey structure, where what it does is the introduction of the anti-hero's theme, which is this person who's unfortunately, the jig is up, hangman's coming down and from the gallows, and but it takes it up, it looks like two bars. I don't know if that'd be three-fifths of an octave, but so it comes to the pinnacle of it, and it's three-fifths higher, and it's got like the cute little jingle. The jig is up, the news is out. They finally found me, the renegade who had it made. And so I thought that was interesting. If I'm surprised Jennifer hasn't heard that song. It's a pretty famous song, but
I also have this problem with music where I can't always understand the lyrics. So maybe if I could hear it, yeah.
yeah, you may have just never heard the
Wrong
song.
part.
I mean,
Or
it's a
maybe
pretty
I
pop.
never heard it.
But I sang from the hero's journey to the anti-hero's journey, and the song itself is noting it because kind of like you can't sin and get away with it. Karma is factual. So like the rock star knowing that it's coming to an end, that that, like, lawman is hangman's eventually going to come down from the gallows and put a stop to my crimes. And so you could kind of call that like a theme of America, like America, like, we're coming to an end. We know that what we're doing is not karmatically sound, and karma will eventually get the better of us. And so this is 1979, and from the 70s to the 80s becomes a pivotal switch. Uh, I don't think the anti-hero really fully arises till the 90s, like with grunge. But already in the the beginning 1979, you could see the rise of the anti-hero, and then maybe there's more songs like that, like Bon Jovi's "Wanted Dead or Alive," that have a similar theme to the rise of an anti-hero. But if you just think the hero's journey musical structure is the same, whether it's the anti-hero or the hero or the love song or the lust song, the musical structure, demonstration of the hero's journey for the purpose of artistically making a journey for the hero or anti-hero is the same, whether it's a hero or an anti-hero. So hopefully, well, Nick Petras hadn't even heard of that song. Yeah, so you get your classic rock. Um, I think that's still a pretty popular song on the radio. Even the classic rock station in Metro Detroit, New York. I remember that was a pretty popular song, still played till today. So with that, welcome to Week in Review.
Yeah, very busy week. And appreciate the chance to go to the consciousness conference. I thought it was overall really positive. Do you remember the person who was saying in the chat that they like sharing their email to get in touch to have them send a write up?
No,
Jason?
I mean, there was one woman who was like half of the comments in the chat, like the Debbie, were hers, and a few others. But the chat was pretty dead generally. There were a few people that just put in a few comments here and there, and then there was one woman that was like making comments in basically all of the programs, and a few other people, maybe me being equal, that put a few comments in. But I remember a few people putting forward contact information, or looking for partners to do research. I think the networking value of the online aspect of the conference was pretty weak. That's why I said that financially, because I have such a strong interest in consciousness, I don't think it was a bad investment. It was probably worth it, and maybe if Jennifer doesn't mind, I'll even read my full essay, because there's a lot of important stuff in there. But just as a general investment for the networking value, it probably wasn't worth it. Most doctors go to this stuff because they need continuing education courses, and they get credit for it, and they need so many hours every year for their accreditation, or if you were part of like a university program. Uh, but because so few people research consciousness or interested in it, that like, okay, you throw some money to and I've been watching their videos, like relatively, like a super chat or something. But I've been watching the Science of Consciousness conference. They post all their videos and make it publicly available for for years now. So I've consumed basically all of their content.
Well, we appreciate you being here to give us the short form. So, all in
Don
all,
Willis
I mean,
here.
I just wish you could have been more appreciative of the conference because I felt super appreciative of it, and the amount of stuff I learned was really
I was
great.
appreciative. I was just making an objective monetary assessment that wasn't worth
Sure.
the money for the networking value. That it was almost like charity. That I'm saying, like paying so much money to online do it was almost like giving charity to the conference because you want the conference to keep on going. So what had nothing to do with my appreciation of the conference. It was an objective assessment of the monetary value of the price that they charged for the value that was received.
Yeah. For me, it's hard to translate value financially
I'm a
to
merchant, and so
experience.
I don't expect you to understand that. Or I mean, maybe you could conceptually, but it's like I'm a merchant, and you have to truth discovery for multiple truth hypotheses based on price discovery. So in terms of like a price discovery, it was overpriced. The price for the online attendance was overpriced, but I paid it. I'm not upset that I paid it because I value the subject, and like it's like giving money to a good cause. I'm just making, as a merchant, I'm making the objective note that it was overpriced.
Alrighty. Well, certainly appreciate you footing the bill for that. And yeah, I gotta. I haven't actually looked through the entire thing yet, and I didn't know if you were interested. So I was gonna ask you if you want me to send it to. Like, I don't like getting unsolicited links, so I didn't want to send you any. Um, but yeah, it's from what I've seen, it's basically yet another theory that points to some ill-defined metaphysical primitive that is basically just wallpapering over interpretational problems. And so I'm sympathetic to that. Um, but there's that
Because it's a
unknown
mirror
time.
image of you.
Well, it's not about whether there's an unknown unknown. Every system has the problem of the unknown unknown. And yes, possibly that's valid criticism, what you just said there. It's can you begin to make meaningful incursions in knowability of unknown unknowns? And when you're not at all able to because we've been down this road and it's frustrated you and it's totally understandable. It's like definitional regress really only demonstrates the issues with definitions. And then that's supposed to sort of come to some like you kind of have to be leading someone to a conclusion with these types of reasonings. So yeah, I haven't looked over the whole thing. It's very long. And as had I forget, like it's not necessarily true that if you can't explain something simply that it's that you don't understand it. It's possible that the on the other side, the capacity for understanding is just not there. But it's not a good sign if you can't summarize what you're trying to say succinctly. It does give the impression of either being indirect for some dishonest reason or not understanding your own position well enough to be able to just succinctly, there it is, the way you'd expect from a peer reviewed, published, predetermined format type thing where there's very clear guidelines as to, summaries and historical reviews and definitions and apparatus and so forth. So I will have a look at it, but I don't know how much is going to be meaningful because I'm going to identify basically the metaphysical depth of the coordinate system nearly instantly and say it's either too shallow or it's too deep because there's not really any such thing as the right level. What the right level is being able to vary it so that you can make incursions meaningfully into the unknown unknowns. All right. So hello, Titan. Great to see you. Effluent, Doug Pluto, Morla. Proud. Anyway, I'm never going to be Amy Newman with these names, but hi, and thanks for coming. And I love you guys and gals and everyone else in between. So, right.
Yeah, the real only future of Week in Review would be to have these people on and speak to them. And I mentioned you're kind of unfriendly, that you have to take a more friendly approach to streaming to talk to these people, and because very rare people want to be invited on to be bashed. But and even organizing a conference, like and my went over the history. So if you actually have an institute or funding are trying to collect together people. Um, and to some extent, you could try like a bait and switch, but you have to work with who's there. And if these are the the type people that you're getting, you have to work with who you have. And it's unlikely that you're going to just be able to. Sometimes you can have a big break and make it into the big leagues, and then leave everyone else behind. And sometimes it does work like that a little bit, but more likely you have to build up uh, with a group. And if it's you're saying like I should be the one presenting the solution, as more like the humble approach to the student, and you're saying that there's a masonry behind it, a process. And there's group the masonry, that there's experts, and the experts of the previous generation gather and talk about and polish on up their expertise. And then as a person of the next generation, you join that group of experts, and maybe get a mentor from the previous generation. And then you have colleagues that you work together with. And then after like a decade of going to the conference, you start presenting. And they have younger presenters, but they're usually from think tanks. And I do want to go more into the nature and structure of the conference. I actually wanted to put together conferences like that myself when I first came back to Detroit. Um, my mother was the lawyer for Greektown. I actually, she had done legal work for all the casinos, and the big three, in used to be General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, but now the Detroit big three are the casinos: MGM Grand, uh, Greektown, and Motown uh, Casino. Uh, but my mother was, basically the one of the head lawyers for Greektown Casino, and the city, for tax purposes, required them to build a convention center, where they didn't really, there was no need for a convention center. There's really not that many conventions in Detroit, but for like a zoning law tax base, they required the casino to build a theater and a convention center, even though they didn't really have any demand for it. And so I had thought like I should try to organize conferences, like medical conferences. Specifically, I thought medical conferences, because those are something that would be profitable, because doctors are required uh, for their license to actually go to those. But I couldn't find anyone to work together, and there wasn't really any interest. And even if I could have gotten in contact or had an into the casino, and ironically, at that point, I didn't even have my bachelor's degree, but you could have had just some Orthodox Jew who was trying to make some money organizing these conferences. Uh, and a lot of times it is like that, the organization structure, that the people who have the knowledge aren't really so good at the organization, especially the merchant capitalizing off of it. Um, but yeah, I went through that whole detail of how I'd considered Italy, and even attempted to try to organize conferences. And I've organized chess tournaments, uh, that in Detroit, and we actually did use the casino's convention center for chess tournaments. But so if you do want to talk about the logistics, but the greater masonry, where experts meet, and you have to build your way up. You start, as an apprentice, and move your way up, and then eventually, you become senior. And that's probably the path that you should you'll be looking to take. And that means working together with karmatically who's put in front of you. You could seek out a mentor or something like that. But
Yeah.
and you could consider interviewing, having on the show. We can review. I've complained to Jennifer that it hasn't really been a good venue for guests, but I'm not even sure we've been able to get guests. But that we should be trying to bring on and interview and talk to people in the field.
Um, yeah. So the issue is the ethical concerns that I have.
Yeah, I mean, you got ethical concerns just talking to people or just, like, not being
That's
mean
right.
to
I
people.
have ethical concerns with
Just
just
not being
talking
mean
to
to
people
people.
sometimes if it means I'm going to be giving them the impression that I'm in some way saying that what they're doing is all right.
Yeah, I was gonna make conferences and like, Jennifer can't even, like, talk to someone without being mean to them, without, her ethical concerns.
Well, you're saying I'm being mean. To me, I'm warning people against a very real concern. And if it means if people don't want to be warned that way, then okay, I guess I just won't talk to them. It's like, all right, well, so then I get a mentor, so then I have to deceive this person as regards how I'm feeling it, and then it's like, that seems really stressful and pointless. So it's I want to, I just don't know how to do it and still feel like I'm in conformity with my principles.
You probably can't, and so, saying you won't be able to avail yourself to the process, and therefore you'll lose out on all of the benefits, or you'll max out on, like, symbolically your rise in the degrees that, you have to avail yourself to the process. There's no way, uh, other than to do that, and it means compromising your standards, and, you'll probably actively be forced to do that, and, you can't really succeed in the system without doing that. And if it's,
Sure.
similar to, like, God forbid, like, racists or religious fundamentalists or any of the other, dissidents on the web that, don't want to conform to the system because it goes against their principles, the system will weed you out, or, because of that, because that's the purpose. That's how systems work. And, you might find someone like Doovid who doesn't even care. They're just putting together and charging admission, and you just be like, "You're out. I'm sorry. Like, you're not conforming. You're hurting the bottom line. You're out." And so almost all systems are like that. There's going to be someone there that, could have been me if it had worked out differently. That was just organizing, trying to make money off of it, and would have seen you as someone that was, making, putting my financial success into jeopardy, and would have just forced you out. There could be ideological, but, in the capitalistic system, it would just be like, "Oh, this is bad for business. She's not going to conform. You got to force her out." But, in
Yeah, so me
universe,
worrying about spiritual implications is something that is socially unacceptable, and I accept that. So I'm at least glad that it's been identified as an issue, and I don't know what else to say, but there you go.
yeah, I mean, you could work with you play your hand the best you can. So if you just decided, like, it's like if you're Jehovah's Witness, or, you're a, ultra Haredi Jew, and you say, "I'm not going to be going to university." I mean, Jennifer actually has a university degree, but I mean, if you're just like, "Okay, I'm Jehovah's Witness, I'm not going to university," it's not going to happen. But you still want to advance in the field without, even going to university. Uh, you could play your hand to the best of your ability, and, if you're going to compromise your principles, that's why, Dubin was probably supposed to go to medical school, and evolution was so irritating to me that I basically forsook becoming a doctor. But,
Could you tell us a little
that's
more about that?
why I mentioned many times. Is just saying that that's the facts on the ground, that, like, you can't. I mean, even if you do good on the test, it's saying, like, you like, and, even just shut up, and, fall in line. And if you can't do that, you're not going to succeed, because the system forces submission upon you, and, no matter how smart you are, uh, you can't navigate through the system without submitting. So you become a dissident. You could have success as a dissident. You could, have financial success, certainly. Although, um, institutional success is much more difficult. Sometimes, if you gain a large enough following, you could be grandfathered into the institution, largely through elections and public officials. That, people need to win elections, and if you have enough of a following, that, public officials will include you in their coalition in order to, win elections, and then they could grandfather you in, even though you didn't, go in through the way, and then there'd always be pushback. on that is, I mean, it is possible to, so to say, beat the system, but it's extremely rare and unlikely. Things like money are always a trump, or popularity. So I mean, just having your own channel, 1,000 subs, you could get the message out. You could, so to say, have your own cult that uh, largely bottom feeds and picks up other dissidents, or if you're part of a hereditary um, traditional movement that's a dissident movement due to long-standing conflicts with the status quo, like, say if you're Jehovah's Witness or you're some sort of religious fundamental, and there's a long-standing conflict between you and the system, that people know, oh, you're part of this dissident group, and therefore you're in conflict with the system. um, but these things should still fall into systematic rules. And if you're trying to advance a theory, your theory should compensate and and even predict, make sense why it predicts that it's the way that it is, that a false system would arise to become the dominant system and keep you out. And so if you're a religious cult like ultra Orthodox Jews, Jehovah's Witness, you maybe
I
even,
guess I feel like it's an evolving conversation that, as the understanding deepens,
well, I
harmonize.
mean, most cults will frame it as us against the world, where we have a certain amount of truth and have a special mission to the world, and to some extent the whole world is factually against us, like, the Adam Green
That's not
interpretation.
mine is, if you like hanging out in a boneyard and being blazed, this might be for you.
Well, I mean, so you just like talking, I mean, you don't actually have ambitious goals, like, I mean, so say
To me, a
religious.
society where people value the role of somebody who takes away dead bodies that nobody else could care for, that is worth working towards.
Well, I mean, so if you just want your friends, so, and, to pass the time and to play your hand as best as possible, but realizing you're not really going to have much of an impact, and saying, so you might recruit a few friends and or a little following, but you appreciate or have accepted, resigned to the fact that you're not going to have a big impact, as opposed to more cultish movements like that.
This is how I see it. I am not that important. The impact I can make has to do with the amount of improvement I can bring to civilization as a whole, which is kind of a like lowest common denominator deal. That's more along the lines of how I feel.
Yes, I'm much more. I guess I'm much more ambitious than Jennifer, and that's one of probably the constant.
But I want to help support your ambitions to whatever extent that I can. I mean, that's not as hard as it is for me to get out of the gate with stuff.
Yeah, I don't even mind looking at things as like me against the world, and
Sure. I mean,
you know,
that's completely common. And I mean, I think the romantic love trope is, blank versus the world, the common one.
yeah, I mean, like the song guys sing, the Renegade. The jig is up, the news is out. They finally found me, the renegade who had it made. Um, but if you just look like that, like like it's just a jig, and is eventually going to come to an end. That was fun while it lasted, and that's all it was, and it's eventually going to come to an end, and that'll be it, and then I'll be relegated to mediocrity, and like all, even whatever I had that wasn't mediocrity was just a jig that was going to come to an end. And if you have a philosophy that really all there is mediocrity, then how do you understand the system? Or however you look at it, that like conspiracies, or by projecting onto the system as like that they're really don't know what they're doing as much as they think they do, or that just as good as the people in power. Like I mentioned, the one of the bands I promoted, Blanket Statement Steens, and their song "Watch Me on TV, Baby." That so eventually you're relegated to just being an NPC, which is saying that's not what I want to do. And I do think, like that I'm trying to forward and advance ideas and say, essentially I do want to be accepted in um, the academy. I don't want to compromise
In what capacity?
that. I want my ideas to be accepted in the academy. That even if I don't conform to their standards in general, that to say that made an impact, and my impact was accepted by the people even in the academy who conformed to the standards, which I didn't.
Oh, well, thanks for sharing.
So to say that, okay, so you'll unlikely ever be a presenter at the consciousness conference. So you didn't.
I don't want to be. I'd rather someone else do it or a bunch of other people do it than me.
Yeah. So I mean, if it's so if it's just like a LARP, saying, well, you don't actually have anything to present anyway.
It's
So
not a LARP, but is it
it's
so
not that you didn't conform to their
incomprehensible that I don't
standards.
want to be the person delivering it because I am not very good at that? I would rather someone who was actually good at that do it rather than me who's liable to, sound irritated or something.
Yeah, or just
You're
saying,
projecting what you want on me. It's like, do I necessarily need to be giving a presentation at a conference? It's like, no, I'd rather a bunch of other people give presentations.
yeah, or you say that you have nothing to present anyways.
Or I've given several presentations and caused a bunch of people to get pissed at me as a result. I don't want to go over that again. You don't relate to my experience on that level. Can you just accept that I feel differently about this?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, that's a given.
I still have the same intention. I want the academy to get better. But I know that my presence can sometimes be too much for certain situations. It's just not conducive to the development of certain types of ideas. I'm just reminded of the one time it's like getting into like when you get up in some guy's face, like have you ever had that where you've had like physical altercations, right? Like when it doesn't quite become a physical.
Yeah, I mean, so we just move on, but my point about conferences in general, and I'll call the masonry or the system of things work, and even an understanding of consciousness and universal systems that you're saying we're humans and we're subject to these systems, and that consciousness interests me. So you're saying to participate, to learn more, to pay money to to the people that are advancing ideas, um, to join the major organizations of people. So you're an engineer, you'd be like Doovid's not a licensed engineer, um, but you're professional, you're registered with the state. Even as a civil engineer, it could be a licensed civil engineer that could stamp documents for state certification. And then there's a whole bunch of organizations you could be a member of. And if you're a bigger company, then usually you're one of the sponsoring organizations, and so to say that your name's on the building. So there's the Engineering Society of Detroit. Doovid was a member for many years. I let my membership lapse over the last few years. But you say like no, like the bigger engineers, where they're one of the sponsoring organizations. So when you go to the Society of Engineers, there's someone speaking, there's sponsors, and so this is just kind of I refer to it masonry, but that's technically uh, a more esoteric classification. It's just organizational structures, and I'll call the science of expertise, which kind of like consciousness is. a largely undefined field, that there's not a clearly defined science of expertise. So I'm kind of hypothesizing on how these structures work, but I'm proposing that generally experts meet and trade information and secrets. That could be like chess or something, or anything where you have this lone person that garnered expertise on their own. But the masonry would suppose that no, experts do gather and trade secrets, that every organization, every field of expertise will have organizations where the experts meet, and that's just a process. And then, like Kuhnian scientific revolutions, that things could get out of whack, and there's corruption, and the nature of human nature is to be corrupt, that the leaders of the field of experts will try to push it in a certain direction. We'll try to pick winners and losers. We'll try to advance their picks and possibly hold back the people that go against what they're trying to forward. And that's a given of human nature and structures. So, for whatever reason, Jennifer is recognizing that the current class of experts have decided in a certain way, and if she's pushing things or believes in a way that goes against the consensus, that the coalition of experts will generally hold her back, not push her forward. And that's the nature of the masonry. And if you're right, saying that, okay, well, sometimes you're right, sometimes your idea is better than the coalition of experts, then there's also a systematic understanding of how you uh, go about that. And even conflict theory, and other aspects, like if you can't follow the straight path of you enrolling at the academy, submitting to what the academy wants of you, and rising within the system.
Yeah, I just you just sort of said it though. You're like, there's no consensus on consciousness. How can you rise through a system if there's no system to rise through?
Well, I think you have to work with what there is. So I think at the end of the day, there are still experts, and the experts do still gather. So it's
Are
not if
they going
you.
to be willing to agree to the label of expert on consciousness? Because if you recall, someone during the presentations was asked to give a definition of consciousness, and they said a basic awareness of the situation. And but they also made a point in saying, well, I don't think I can actually give a complete definition. So I don't know that anyone's willing to, and I don't think Dr. Hammeroff has either put themselves forward as an expert on consciousness.
Yeah, so I mean, eventually it would be like medicine or engineering, where there'd be certification and standardization. And so consciousness is not at the point where there's certification and standardization. There's not even really like a degree in consciousness. There's no license of being certified experts in consciousness that would allow you to do something. And let alone that the, so to say, experts would standardize definitions like that. But that the structure of organizations is that as the field grows, it will go through a canonization process. And just saying that whoever, so to say, experts, the people with the best understanding, people writing books, forwarding theories, head of institutes, um, do gather and do talk to each other, but not quite at the point yet where there's been a standardization process like medicine or engineering, or law or accounting or something like that. But you could see it's in the process of a standardization process, or maybe it'll never be standardized. And, so that's not a field that's worthy or necessitates standardization. And, so that would mean that expertise in the field is largely meaningless. It doesn't matter. There's no significance to being expert. And in a religious sense, that if you're an expert of consciousness within a tradition, that's bestowed upon by the given tradition, not by some like medicine, where like you could be bestowed as a doctor within your tradition, but it goes against the law for you to practice medicine if you don't have a licensed medical degree or don't do it within the confines of um, given the given system. But but I was saying these standardization processes are something that I studied management and organizational structures, so it's one of the things I like to ramble on, and they're kind of esoteric in nature, and I like to use the historical model of Freemasonry to discuss organizational structures. It's kind of like consciousness in that manner that historically theologians and philosophers discuss consciousness mostly in a dualistic nature. So you could show your intellect and knowledge of the field by discussing it in the classical manner. So organizational structures were historically discussed in the um, realm of Freemasonry. So you could show your intellectual bona fides by talking about Freemasonry, and so people read the literature, they know that you're right, that these people were Freemasons and understood these organizational structure in terms of Freemasonic degrees, even though that's probably not the dominant model today. But you could also abstract a pure reason of understanding, abstract understanding of organizational structures, or just current organizational structures if people aren't familiar with the historic Freemasonry in organizational structures. When I talk like the Royal Society, that there used to be a Royal Society, and there was a king, and there was experts, and they had budgets, and it's still like that today. If I read my paper, mention like the Allen Institute. What's the big deal of Christoph Koch in the Allen Institute? Do you know?
I don't think that's how that word is pronounced.
Christopher Koch in the Allen Institute?
I think it's like Koch or something. Like it's
Like the Koch brothers?
yeah, it seemed to be closer to that one. Just thinking. Anyway,
It's spelled C-O. Maybe it's C-O-K, K-O-C-H or K-O-C-K. Um, but Peter Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, donated $100 million to create the Allen Institute for brain research, brain studies in Seattle. So Christoph Koch is the president of the Allen Institute, and they have a huge budget, and he has money to fund people. And when he spoke, there was a long line of people talking about projects, and he was answering questions like, "What do you have to do to get money for your project?" So, I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Allen and the history of Microsoft, but that he's the head of an institute that has a huge endowment of $100 million, uh, makes him a big name in consciousness studies. Not only the fact that he's one of the leading researchers of neural correlates of consciousness and writing papers and putting out theories, but that also he could give you money. That if you wrote a proposal and had a good idea, that he would give you money. And also the other big name, um, Neil Seth. Yeah, I was sharing the videos making the round. And Neil Seth is the head of the Sackler Institute of Consciousness Studies. And I don't know how big their endowment is, but I assume the Sacklers, it probably has tens of millions of dollars. So Neil Seth, in that manner, is the head of an institute, and if you're on his good side or you make it through his process, he could fund your projects, as opposed to Dr. Hamarov, who probably doesn't have large sums of money. He can't fund your project, and therefore they have to charge
and
high
I'm
rate.
duty bound by tradition to honor people's efforts, and he did a good effort. I'm not expecting money from him.
Well, I wasn't talking about you. I'm just talking about the
Okay.
structure of consciousness studies.
I'm just hoping you don't think that I think I'm going to get money from Dr. Hameroff. Just that's all. Anyway, please continue. Very good.
Well, Hamarov doesn't have money to give people. I was saying Neil Seth and Christoph Koch have money to give people. Hamarov doesn't. Hamarov, has to, difficulty just funding his own research institute. he doesn't have a large endowment. Um, that's why they have to charge large sums of money for their conference. But he still has an institute, and so they're doing studies. They have researchers at university who are part of the medical school. University of Michigan has a consciousness studies where they're doing research. They have PhD students. So there were various institutes that have PhD students doing research. The funding aspect is important. That's part of the masonry structure, that you're going to have the Sacklers and Paul Allen at the end of the day, someone who is capable of writing checks for tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to create an institute like Brian Keating and the Simon Foundation, at University of California, the Simon Center for mathematics or whatever, because the Simon wrote a big check to fund his institute. And so Hammeroff has his donors, but he doesn't have a large endowment to fund other people. He probably just barely keeping his own institution open. Um, but he has the conference, he has the ideas, he's done the legwork in organizing people internationally. So if you're at the Allen Institute or the Sackler Institute, people come to you because of the money. Saying that they know that you have money to fund research, and they write proposals. So I'm not saying Jennifer, but someone like Jennifer, more likely someone who would be like a PhD candidate somewhere, would have an idea, and they would need funding, and they would write a grant to one of these institutes, and so someone like Hameroff doesn't have money to give people. He might know and have influence with the people who do have money, but he might have expertise in the subject where, like, can you read my paper? Can you look over? Could you give me a little bit of advice, mentorship? So you need both. Like, a lot of times you just need money. At the end of the day, I know what I'm trying to do, and I just need money to fund my research and the equipment, or the various costs. And then sometimes you need expertise, from the previous generation, people who know the names, people who know, like I said, for any scientific paper, the what's already been researched, what's already been done.
Okay.
And just like having publishing a paper, like I said, like Jennifer could self-publish a paper. She could submit it for peer review, possibly get it submitted into a journal. Like, she doesn't necessarily need funding. If for some reason, if she was doing the research on the quantum periodic table, and it turned out that it needed some sort of experiment, and that it needed some sort of equipment, then she would have to submit a grant proposal for funding. That would include possibly paying herself or a PhD student to do the research, and the space rental, or the logistics and the purchasing of the necessary equipment. And it would be one of these big foundations like the Allen Institute, that has huge uh, multi-million dollar foundation that's specifically designed to give grant to scientific research. And that has basically always been the way that science has worked, of patronage, from really ancient times through today, is that there's a patronage system, and that includes non-scientific financial sponsorship. Sometimes the sponsorship comes from scientifically uh, competent people, but many times not, and scientific mentorship, that you need to get patronage from people who have money to support the idea, and then you need mentorship from the experts in the field to guide you in your research, and you do that by things like attending conferences.
Interesting proposal of patronage. Yeah, it's a really good point in terms of historical meta narratives, or whatever you want to call them. The notion of patronage. We've been over this, haven't we? We had a big digression into connection to the word father historically, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean the patronage comes from the word father.
Yeah, so interesting to look at it like that, as a networking as a means to gain patronage, and so making the thing facing in that direction.
Well, and I mean, it's systematic that if you have a really good idea, money will come to you. That or if you have it, in the masonry, so say if you advance through the degrees, that you will be part of the other people who've also advanced through the degrees. And if you've advanced through the degrees through research, through the military, through politics, through your business, that there'll be other people who fill in the pieces of the puzzle to help you. So as you advance through the degrees and you say, well, what'd you do? And like, well, I got my PhD and I read all these books and had this theory. And what this other person do? Well, they didn't do that, but they built up a business and have a large bank account. And the forces will align, and it's just it's organizational structures where it's even more than interdisciplinary studies. Interdisciplinary studies is specifically like academic, referring to fields of studies. The masonry is more complicated than just interdisciplinary studies because it includes really all of human organization, and will include things like military science, business, politics, uh, your real estate, environmental concerns, that so just say the field of experts will be brought together, but then there'll be the pressing needs of humanity, and the pressing needs of humanity will cause the experts in those fields to bring those people together. So if it's like like historically was the king, like I mentioned in Euler's time, where Euler was a pure mathematician, and he became the number two in the Bavarian Royal Society, uh, under I think one of the Habsburgs, uh, and most of what he did was solving specific issues for the crown, and the crown knew those issues because they were in charge of running the state, and a lot of those things had to do with navigation. So if Euler himself was more interested in pure mathematics, and because he was a great mind, he was recruited into the Royal Society. But because he took lower birth, he always had financial difficulties. He didn't have, and he needed money, and so he would get paid by solving the problems facing humanity. And because he took lower birth, he may not have been aware or cared so much about the problems facing greater humanity, as where you're in charge of running the state. The problems facing greater humanity are important to you, because it affects the bottom line of business, and might mostly be seen in military science. Like, okay, I took low birth. I just want to find a wife and reproduce and do my research. But the state's at war. I don't care about the war, but the state cares about the war. And if you have something that's useful to the war, they'll recruit you to that cause. And so historically, scientists are also recruited to the state to direct their wisdom towards military science, in various things. Mathematicians, a lot of things were related to navigating the sea, towards engineering feats, irrigation, bridge building, uh, various things. And so that's just systematic. That Jennifer's like a country girl with a high IQ, and she gets her degree in physics, and then so well now we need to put you at work something useful for the state, and so she ends up working in voice, whatever field she works in, because it's useful to the state, and might be minorly
I
interesting to
felt
her.
like I got a sign that involved a minor altercation with the professor in a pool, so I felt like it was destiny in a way.
What I'm saying, it, yeah, I mean it's your destiny, but it's saying because so to say, the state that you took birth, and you develop
I'm a
expertise,
humble servant of
and yeah,
mankind.
so you're put to use. You're not the one putting other people to use. Saying you took lower birth, so you were put to use. If you took higher birth, you would be the one putting other people to use. And a lot of times, the people who took higher birth don't have the expertise, but because they took higher birth, they have an awareness of the problems facing humanity, and will recruit the people for to put them towards the problems that humanity faces. And so as saying, like, the masonry will force these people together, where all of a sudden, like, you're in the same group with military leaders, business leaders, heads of state, or various things, and what you're providing is expertise on the subject matter. And then you'll see that these people in charge of, so to say, running the state, running the affairs of larger society, may not actually have expertise on those subjects, and often don't.
Yeah. As it becomes more, I mean, esoteric. I mean, when a domain is known by a small number of people, there's a question as to what it even means to have expertise.
But because you took lower birth, you don't have the weight of running the state on your shoulders. So, like, they said, like, God forbid, I showed the survey that half of Israelis fear that there's going to be another Holocaust. If you want to say, like, just being Jewish. So, if we say, like, a form, being Jewish is a form of taking higher birth, and Jews feel the weight of running society on our shoulders. And, so, like, Jews aren't the only ones, so to say, taking higher birth. But as you take higher birth, you have the weight of running society on your shoulders. If you take lower birth, you don't have the weight of society on your shoulders, but you have poorness, poverty, lack of resources on your shoulders. So you take higher birth, you don't have the worries of lack of resources, but you have the worries of running the state. If you take lower birth, you don't have the burden of running the state, but you have the burden of not having resources. So if you were
Almost like
born,
some sort of canonical conjugation relation.
yeah, I mean, it's factual. Say if you were brought up, the son of a landholder, um, your parents ran the land. They took care of the land, and you knew that one day you would inherit the land and would have to be able to take care of it. And as opposed to if you took lower birth and your parents weren't landowners, your parents probably had financial difficulties and had to work the land for the landowners in order to just have subsistence, but they didn't have the worries of running the land on them. And so the kid of the person, the kid of the landowner has that weight on their shoulder, that eventually they're going to have to run the land and are going to have to understand how to do it, as where the kid of the worker doesn't have the burden of needing to run the land, but they have the burden of poverty and lack of resources.
Very interesting take. I never heard anyone say anything like that before, so it's very interesting.
It's kind of, I mean, I've mentioned this many times, is the higher low birth thing that is probably the single most triggering thing I say. But it's extensively written into the Kabbalah and the Vedas, where almost always the Vedas will
There's a lot of
frame.
claims about some sort of casteism in the Vedas, but the closest I've seen to a reference isn't even in the Vedas. It's in some Brahma sutras about the children of Brahmins inheriting more karma than children of the other Varnas. That's hardly,
It just frames
prescriptive.
it frames people in the birth that they took.
All
Like
it's saying is that you have more associated karma by virtue of being born a priest, not that you're destined to even be a priest by being born one. No, that's the closest I could get. I was like, burden of proof. People keep saying this stuff. Burden of proof. Bring it to me. Never even seen anything in the Vedas itself that wasn't a misconstruction by white supremacists. Um, and the
well, I
closest
think
I've seen
it brings
is
people's
something that's not even the Vedas. It's some Brahma Sutra stuff.
Well, I mean,
And it's
most
not even saying that as far as I'm concerned.
it frames people within their parental lineage and saying like a
That's
caste system,
Gotra, not Varna.
and whether you could change that, saying like the caste system is being um, permanently cast versus changeable, but saying it's noted in almost all the stories, the person's birth is considered important information. So it's saying the most, so from that, the most important thing
Yeah, because of Prakriti and
for me to
Makruti, that's
understand
an
Jennifer
Ayurvedic concept, sure.
is the standing of her parents. So if Jennifer was mentioned in the Vedas, she would be, the first piece of information likely to be given would be details about her parents, her lineage.
My lineage would be
So I mean,
given
in the Bible
first.
also, characters
My
are,
lineage is not my parents.
well, but it would be, get me, your parental lineage would also be
My
given.
parental lineage would be mentioned after my spiritual lineage. The
Well,
spiritual
I see,
always trumps the physical.
but I mean, make a point. So it's saying Jennifer took low birth, but despite her low birth, has this great spiritual lineage, or saying Jennifer, took noble birth, saying it's mentioned, whether that it's important information, and so okay, Jennifer is an important character because of her spiritual lineage, despite her taking average birth. It's an important factor, and it would include things like like why you have crap computer or system, because like you don't have why can't you just like buy a new computer? Well, because you took average birth, you don't have the money to do it. Saying that like it just relatively obvious things that are triggering, and people like in the West, you just don't talk about money because it's triggering, but informationally, okay, Jennifer is a great soul, but she doesn't have a big bank account because she took average birth, or like Jennifer was able to withdraw,
Doovid is always trying to bait me into talking about my portfolio.
or saying you were able to withdraw from your responsibilities because you didn't have that many responsibilities. Saying like if you had a family business to move into or something like that, withdrawing from your familiar responsibilities would have been a bigger deal. Saying if you took lower birth, it's not such a big deal to withdraw from the your non your responsibilities that don't exist.
Yeah,
So
I
saying
think
that's
even my lunar birth date would be more important than my parents.
by saying it would be
The
mentioned.
last thing on the list.
It's mentioned as important details. Almost no character in the Vedas or the Bible is mentioned without their parental lineage. It's one of the most single essential details that saying like you that it would be, what's your name, who's your daddy. It would be in the first sentence. It's essential information, and you're like, oh, high IQ. Jennifer's father was a respected. I'm just making it up, but you're saying not Jennifer, but people was a school teacher, like was a math. This girl I went to school with that did well in physics. Not a Rhodes Scholar, but she won one of these scholarships in physics. But her father was a math teacher, so she came from a humble background, but her father was a math teacher, so that's a detail worth mentioning, that she didn't necessarily have uh, large amounts of financial backing, but she came from a background that valued intellect and education. Her father was a math teacher.
That would be like a hypothetical argument to
Well, I'm
justify
just giving an
something.
example to say, okay, that because her father was a math teacher, that that's enough information. So who is this girl that went on to do great things in physics? So okay, your father was a math teacher, saying she took average birth of not much status or wealth, but had some intellectual backing and guidance to take intellectual pursuits seriously. But I mean, just the detailed information. Her father was a math teacher gives you, you may call it caste, but gives you quite a bit of karmatic information about the person. about their social economic status, where you say, okay, despite the person being orphaned and growing up in orphanages and being in and out of prisons, they went on to do great things. So you can say, okay, despite uh, so that if they were, their father was a math teacher, they might not have had the resources to give them the best tutors, but for whatever reason, he took his daughter's education and encouraged her education, and she went far and took her studies seriously and advanced in the academy. Saying versus the person was an orphan and grew up in a troubled background, but yet somehow developed an interest in mathematics and took their studies seriously and ended up excelling in the academy. And so people like Euler, all these famous names, like you have the basic information of their parents is one of the most probably single details. If you only had like a few sentences or even one sentence to give about the person, you'd be like, was the son of a blacksmith or something like Isaac Newton. So it's telling. It's one of the most essential details in his biography that like he was an orphan and his mother remarried, or various people that like Gauss or uh, um, you people who took so to say lower birth, but they came from an academic background. So they took low birth like they were lower class, but they came from an academic background. First thing,
Yeah.
Came from a military background. His father was in the army, and he grew up with a regular, abuse and fights with the neighborhood kids. But it's triggering. Um, it's really not triggering. So like if you're in societies where you're used to it, it's just like
Which part is triggering exactly? I mean, this you basically join like your own imagination, the Game of Thrones plot, and reality into one giant horrifying beast. So it's like, in what school am I listing my parents as the highest predictive factor in my something?
it's societal. So even if you took low birth, like possibly in Hindu cultural and um, Catholic culture, you always introduce yourself as the product of your parents. So the first thing you say about yourself is who your parents are and the
I'm Jennifer,
details.
daughter of Richard.
Well, I mean, just that you can't even say it with a straight face. You have to put on like a fake British accent because you're
I'm just
thinking
saying it's not done in any circles I've come from, but I'm fine if that's how it's done in your circles, and I respect that, and I'd like to learn more. It's just completely
it's not
novel.
done. It's not done with my. I mean, my parents and saying like in the West, in secular American, Canadian, English speaking cultures today, it's generally not done. In India, it's more common. Saying even in Orthodox Jewish culture, it's extremely common in lineage based cultures, say like even Hispanic culture. Even to Arabic and Hispanic cultures, people's names like the last name in Western culture with liberalization and emancipation, they created the last name. But historically, Jews, Arabs, Hispanics, till today, are referred to as their last name is the son of and the son of. So I'm like David, Ben David. Uh, that's be my reference. And if you're an Arab or Spanish culture, you give details just by a continual back lineage of who your father's father is. So in Europe, with the creation of egalitarian, um, emancipated liberal societies, they created the invention of the last name. And the last name has some caste marker also, but saying traditional societies, your last name is your caste marker and is your um, direct relationship to your parents. So I don't need to ask you who your parents. When you tell me your name, you're telling me who your parents are. Like, what's your last name? So you say like, what it's like Jennifer, Jennifer who? So when he said, well, what's your last name? I'm really asking you about your parents.
Yep. And in my traditional understanding, that parents is not particularly wouldn't be predictive in this instance of much.
I don't know
With
what traditional understanding is saying. Like, I mean, from almost all understanding, the person's parent
well,
is the
Dayananda
single most
Swami was
predictive.
inducted into whose lineage? His dad's or his guru's?
If you're talking about individuals that rose despite their lineage, there's always going to be that cases. But even within that, those systems, um, the person's parental
Sure, he
stat,
was
who
born
their
of
parents are,
Brahmin.
is if not the single most important piece of information, is right up there with
And
top
once he
three, top
joins his
five.
guru's lineage, that's the most important piece of information.
I mean, and just because there's and it's saying like no, even if a person took low birth and rose to high status, even hundreds of years later, um,
Citation: Ram, Lord Ram. Is Lord Ram the first thing listed about him, his parents, or the fact that he's Lord Ram?
I want to say the first, but who'd you say, Lord Ram?
What was so special about his parents is what I'm asking. Like that is that the way the story about him is told? It's like not really.
Well, yeah, that was specifically the whole reason why he was in the forest was because of the story with his father. The whole, the whole um, uh, Ramayana is predicated upon his parents. That like he had a family and someone was supposed to become king, and the kingship was given to one of his brothers, and therefore he was in the forest. But saying like, no, I mean, my scholarship, I forget Ram's father, but Ram's father is a key part in the story, and the whole narrative arc of the story is dependent upon who his father is. And it's like even historical characters that took low birth, till today, hundreds of years later, when we read their biography, we say they took low birth. Saying that they either was an orphan or he had an abusive, alcoholic, non-participant father. So I forget the names, but I think even Isaac Newton, saying if he had a bad father, that when you read the biography of Isaac Newton, one of the first things you read about is his bad father.
Okay.
I mean, there's no way around it. It's saying it's triggering uh,
I'm
because we live
concerned
in.
because I don't want to cause any stress to my parents.
Well, that's why I said that's part of your status. So okay, if you took low birth, then you're saying, well, I took low birth. Like any one of these people watching could cause great harm to my parents. You're saying, well, I took high birth. Like my parents have security. Like if someone tried to mess with my parents, like they would spend life in prison. It would probably cost them their life. Like I'm not so worried about that. So it's a factorized into it, and makes sense. And we've discussed that before, and saying like, but it's partially what's so triggering about it, but it shouldn't be triggering. You come to grips with yourself, and you see a lot of famous people. They talk about their parents, and most famous people had average parents, and they mention how average their parents are. So like you have people who are saying like like Destiny, whose parents are typical Trump supporters, or or whatever the story is that people relate, even though they're famous, they could relate to the average person because their parents are average, and they still deal with their parents, and their parents are still average.
I don't know if I'd call them average, but sure. They're
But
not
I'm saying
elite.
it's
They're not.
common. Everybody deals with that, and if you become a public personality, you have to come to some method of dealing with it. And saying just from the wisdom point, it's important, and that's what I was saying. I was talking about patronage, so just saying like, okay, that the high birth, low birth, as you move up in wisdom, you're saying you might say, I would like to apply the wisdom the way I would like to apply it, but a lot of times that's beyond your ability, and you might be able to apply your wisdom the way you would like to apply it, but you're going to have to serve society, and generally that will be, with a consortium of experts, and the consortium of experts will have all sorts of people from, including the patronage class, the business class, uh, the noble class, who may not have your expertise, probably don't have your expertise, but are sitting on the resources, or currently the ones dictating society, even politics. Like, I don't really have, me and Jennifer don't have an interest in politics. Usually it's people with a lower character that have an interest in politics, but at the same time, the people who are charged of administering society's problems are generally these people of lower character. And but so these people of lower character that whatever reason went into politics in order to administer society, at some point society's problems become so great that they need to recruit the great minds to administer society's problems. And so that's why I said, like, the Royal Society historically,
That's where I
that
pull out my 20 million page long CV.
see what.
I said CV as in resume. As in, I'm thinking of that like Hulk Hogan meme where he's like super long listing something, and it's like reasons why I can solve all the problems. I mean, I think I am building up that reputation, but you know, I also know that it's important to have people to push back on stuff like you and people in the audience to keep me on the right path. So I kind of see it as a team effort, and I appreciate it. And I do think sometimes it goes too far in the chat with the harshness. Doovid's entitled as the star of the show, basically, to whatever. But in the chat, just a balance between harshness and learning is all I ask. But yeah, I mean, what's the gap? We don't have the unknown. Not all complaints can be addressed in the same order. Daryl's wondering why you switched from birth to character. I think Doovid is doing his best to explain an extremely complicated phenomenon. I feel that his intention is to be delicate, polite, diplomatic. Would you say you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it came into this because we were talking about patronage, and so patronage comes into the mystery of high and low birth. That why is it me that's seeking out someone else to fund me, or that saying, who is this person that I need their approval to move up in society. And so if it's like, oh, this person garnered expertise, as opposed to patronage, which gets puts more into the question of high or low birth, because you say, oh, well, Kamarov or Penrose, those are people that just dedicated their life to study and are experts on the subject, as opposed to patronage, which is like these people have power or money to advance what I'm trying to do, that is separate from expertise. And so that's like the mystery of high or low birth, as opposed to something that's better understood, like expertise. You just assume that people are expertise because they worked hard at it, studied. Maybe they had, one person might have more the ability than the next. Maybe one person's father's a professor, but at the end of the day, they had to do the hard work, as opposed to patronage and power, which is a lot of times counterintuitive to normal understandings of expertise. And even if you understand that according to expertise, it's still much more triggering. This concept of patronage, but it's factual. Patronage is a factual element of the scientific realm, and as I mentioned, even consciousness studies. The Allen Institute and the Sackler Institute, where it's like, oh, the Sacklers, I hate the Sacklers, but like, if you want funding in consciousness, like Neil Seth is the head of the Sackler Institute, and he's speaking at all these institutes because of the Sacklers. And so just the element of that, a lot of people high birth and low birth is discussed in esoteric studies, specifically Hinduism and Jewish esotericism talks a lot about it. Christian and Islamic focuses less on it. Uh, and so most people just get triggered by it and have conspiracy theories or misunderstandings or hatred towards towards this concept, and patronage in general is just a triggering concept, like, oh, those jerks with all the money, I hate them, and why'd they decide, because they essentially pick winners and losers. And it's very irritating to to be on the losing end of seeing, because there's very few winners, and you're looking at it, well, why'd they choose this guy to be a winner, and why are they not picking this guy, and so I put it almost in as a mystery. And because when you look into it, you come to high or low birth, when you say, well, who is this person, and then you have like a detail, well, they're the son of this person, and what they're, because their dad created this big company, and or some, or had noble birth, and therefore has a bunch of money and is in the patronage status to pick winners and losers.
I don't know what to say to that. I don't know that I would come to that conclusion. You imply there's no talent whatsoever involved. Almost seems to imply that.
Well, if you assume that the patrons are just as much experts as the experts, so it's like, Penrose and Hamerov, versus Sackler and Allen. But if you look at it, okay, maybe Allen and Sackler have much more power than Hamerov or Koch, and then even looking to say, like, well, Seth and Koch have became the gatekeepers to give away Sackler and Allen's money. So we just, got into it through the consciousness, and I was mentioning that Koch is the head of the Allen Institute that has a $100 million endowment, and Seth is the head of the Sackler Institute. And I didn't look at how big their endowment is, or like Brian Keating has a huge grant from the Simon Foundation, and so they're gatekeepers in terms of giving away money, and as opposed to Penrose and Hamerov are experts, but they're not. I mean, they have some gatekeeping role in the money giving away process, but saying they, like, if you went to Hamerov and asked for advice, he give you advice. If you went to Hamerov and asked for money, he would refer you to Koch or Seth, and he might write you a letter of recommendation, and that might make a difference with Seth or Koch. But at the end of the day, uh, Hamerov and Penrose aren't in the patronage class; they're in the expert class, and somehow Koch and Seth from the expert class became gatekeepers to the patronage class. And there's some level in that. Like a lot of times, I'd say it's systematic, but it's saying, because it's very complicated, most people don't understand. Money is a mystery to them, and it's irritating, because you see, because money is time. I have to work for so many dollars an hour, and yet there's these patrons that could free me of the burden of my work, and then you see other people who are freed of the burden of their work through patronage.
Well, aren't
And
you in
so,
the mindset of enjoying it for its own sake? The Especially your online business. I mean, would you want to close that up even if you did get a bunch of money?
well, I'm not sure. I mean, saying that I would, saying that it could be a virtue in itself to be a merchant. That even if I had a bunch of money, that maybe I would still be a merchant. Or you're saying money needs to be nurtured and grown. And a lot of these foundations come from people after they die, like Paul Allen's not alive anymore. um, but it's hard to be an expert at everything. So if you dedicate yourself to some sort of scientific study, it's unlikely you're going to be merchant at the same time. And so, like, Doovid's not a PhD. Like, Doovid's like science and spirituality, but being a merchant has taken a lot of my energies and times away from my studies. And so there's some sort of trade-off. And I remember when I was in rabbinic school, the people that plan on being in the intellectual class, uh, you know, buddy up with the patron class. That if you're a top student, saying like you're gonna befriend the son of the patron class, or intermarry, or various aspects, and you have to plan that out. And saying, well, I don't want to be a merchant, I want to be an intellectual, and therefore I have to scout out patrons. It's just like streaming and super chatting or whatever. You have to nurture your sponsors. Just like we got into talking about a conference. Like conferences, you have to pay, and you have to. Conferences are designed to make money, and like as I said, I thought the conference was more expensive than it should have been, but presumably the money is going towards the intellectual class involved in the research. And so if I'm so to say that they're getting paid more than their market value. But if they got paid their market value, maybe they would quit researching consciousness and do something else. And as someone who likes consciousness, in order to encourage consciousness studies, I have to pay more than the market value for this product. But
I
note that
don't
it's
know
more
that you
than.
can give a market value to something that's that niche.
Well, I mean, there's a price discovery and saying that, but you're saying that how much are these people making relative to other things, and saying that it's more than they deserve, more than their market value. Saying deserve is a loaded word, but saying it's more than the market value.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's no way to estimate the market value for something like that. It's worth what it costs. It's just one of those things where whatever it costs, you have to pay it because it's the only one in its league, really. What's the alternative to this?
Well, saying it has no market value, so it's completely dependent upon the patron class, and so Doovid is, so to say, as an attendee, is in the patron class. So that if you're talking, just a researcher, and there's no market to the research, the only people who value the research are the patrons. So it's like medicine. There's, besides the patron class, there's a market value to being a doctor into medicine. There's a market value to psychiatry, to sleep studies, in these various things. Um, but in terms of advances in consciousness studies, it's only the patron class that cares about it. There might be some people in the general population that are interested in these things, uh, but generally it's just the patron class, and the patron class has to decide how much they're willing to fund people in order to research these things, even though they don't have a large public value. And then you purely base the market value of what these people could do if they put their services out to the public at large.
Sure. So patron is what is needed, and to get a patron, the technology has to be not likely to cause harm.
Well, that might be your value system. I'm saying if you subscribe to the ahimsa principle, but an ultimate karmatic balance, but I'm not necessarily sure there's a relationship to harm. Saying it's usually the patron class is usually worried about the administering of state and businesses. So say if you take high birth, so to say, you run businesses and own land, the affairs of state, are the proper running of the affairs of state, are much more important to you. And the purpose of patronage is to recruit talent into the administration of state with a small amount of general research or discretion towards things that you find interesting. So Euler is brought in by the patron class largely to solve specific problems. He is allowed to research. Euler loves mathematics, and just thinking about mathematics and writing mathematics and having discussions with fellow experts on mathematics, but when he deals with the patrons usually have specific problems that they want him to solve, and these problems are usually directed towards the running of state or business. Till today, saying like Stuart Hameroff, like there's a certain element of the patron class that's concerned with theoretical science and the mysteries of the mind. Um, but Sackler and Allen were probably more concerned with medical advancements. So, I mean, Hamerov's duty to the state and his patrons is largely to do with training and research in anesthesiology, because anesthesiology is an important matter of state, as opposed to the heart problem of consciousness studies is not a pressing matter of state.
Nah, the state doesn't care about consciousness at all.
But I mean, it cares about anesthesiology.
Well, what you're saying is the state, insofar as the university represents the desires of the state, insofar as Tucson University represents the desires of the universities, that, yeah.
Yeah, so it's canonized the system. We need doctors, we need our populace in good health, specifically, uh, the wealthiest and most powerful get the best medical attention, and God forbid, surgery and anesthesiology. That's a known important field of medicine, and so Hamerov's bread and butter is training anesthesiologists and research and advancements in anesthesiology, specifically for practical use in medicine. Um, the direction he had to get his own funding and do a lot of work to advance consciousness studies on his own. But like his day job is more with canonical medical research and training the next generation of doctors, anesthesiologists.
Yeah,
As
that
opposed to the
is
Allen
how it
Institute.
goes. From what I remember in university, it's a publish or perish mentality in terms of getting ahead as a professor.
Yeah, so if Hamerov was so good at anesthesiology that he could train the next generation of anesthesiologists, he published about anesthesiology, and on the side, he's written extremely important research about the science of consciousness and even organized a conference, and that brings fame and glory and maybe more funding to his university. But that's kind of like his discretion. And so it's like, okay, if you could get an endowment like University of Michigan, you've got an endowment to create a consciousness studies, and it's still directly related to anesthesiology, as opposed to the Allen Institute is one single patron. Paul Allen, one of the wealthiest people in the world, co-founder of Microsoft, who gave $100 million to advance research in brain studies. And I don't even think it's connected to medical school or something like that. It's a pure research institute off of the discretion of a single patron.
Good to know that that's how it works. And that's the Institute for Consciousness.
No, the Allen Institute for Brain Studies in
Oh,
Seattle, that Christoph Koch is the head of. Say, and Neil Seth is the head of the Sackler Institute of something. I forget it. You could look that up, but that's why Neil Seth, when he gets introduced and he's speaking at the Royal Society, the Sackler is one of the wealthiest family in the world, and so they're his patron. Hamerov doesn't have so big patrons. Hamerov's more like a workhorse who organized the conference and puts out papers. But they go together in saying that they work together and that's the Masonic system, in that there's some element that's going to cause these people to get together and have meetings and advance the science. And that's going to include uh, the experts, the people in the related fields, and uh, the patrons. And so it goes hand in hand. That so that if you went to the conference, you might you know meet with some of the patrons, and so it's a there's low level patrons like Doovid, who just gave $300 to attend, and then there's high level patrons that give millions of dollars. And I'm not really even a patron. Like, you'd have to they usually have money amount. Like, usually it's straight up, like like you have to give a certain amount of money to get your name mentioned. And at the conference, if you gave a certain amount of money, Hammer would have read your name. Like, I would like to thank my sponsors, just like super chats. We're like reading super chats. It's a canonized system. That's the way it works. And Hamarov, if you donate a certain amount of money, he reads your name off.
All right. Sort of lost me at the end there about the donation of the money. I'm not sure that that's all it takes to. I've never looked into it, so maybe it sounds reasonable.
You take care, Nick. Thanks for tuning in. Check out that Styx song, Renegade. Um, well, I was saying that usually it's in the book. Like, there's a cost to be a sponsor, and it'll tell you exactly what you get. And usually it's transparent, where so to say, like, you pay for a certain amount, and your name appears so big in the program in a list of sponsors, and there's certain privileges, and it's usually purely based on dollar amount levels. And I'm giving an analogy to streaming and super chats. That saying, we will interrupt this program to read a message for super chats over a certain dollar amount. Doesn't matter what they're saying or who it is. And it's similar for programs like this, that if you pay above a certain amount, they will put your name in the program and read off your name at certain points in the program. Maybe if you're too controversial or something, they'll turn down your money, or something like that. Just like, I'm sorry, we can't. But generally, uh, it's a pure quid pro quo, where you pay a certain amount of money, and your name appears so big in the book, and gets mentioned at certain key points in the conference. And and whatever, if it's transparent, sometimes it's not transparent. Like, you could have certain privileges that aren't transparent, like like stacking, you know promoting experts that aren't really experts, getting your people to speak, or various things, or even to negatively causing bad outcomes to your opposition. But if it's transparent, that's not going to come from the money. It's just, so to say that they will read your name and thank you, no matter who you are, if you pay above a certain amount.
I guess it wasn't $300. It was more than $300, whatever the amount would be.
Well, $300 just to be there. So, I mean, in reality, you would say it's not really like a patron; it's like a member. So it's like, okay, like, you become a member of the Royal Society, and there's no membership requirements. All you had to do was pay. If it was the Royal Society, you have to reach something that you gain membership, and then you have to pay the basic membership rate, as opposed to being a sponsor. And if it's like a synagogue or a society like that, it's usually clear, like, where you sit, or there's a hierarchy, and it's clear the hierarchy, because everyone gathers. And you'll see the more important people sitting in different places. Or it's like, okay, you got the Royal Society, and you got in the door, but who's the speaker, who's running the program, who's putting together the program? um, and that's the masonry behind it, where you have the experts and you have the patron class together. So that was the purpose of the Royal Society, was bringing together the nobility, the patrons, and the experts. So people like Euler, Newton, Gauss um, weren't noble, they weren't patrons, they were experts. They were brought in to the Royal Society based on the merit of their hard work, and they were obligated to do certain things for the society. They were given a stipend so that they could do their research, and they were usually required to teach at the university, and who they would be teaching would be mostly the kids of the nobility, combined with the greatest minds of people, even if they took low birth. Um, and then they would also have a requirement to solve certain pressing matters of state, given their expertise. But saying that was the purpose of the creation of the Royal Society, that came from general Masonic structure that brought together the nobility, the patron class, with the expertise class.
Do you see Euler as like the sort of archetypal exponent of that, or just sort of happenstance that you mention him?
I mentioned like him and Newton because they took low birth, and so now you don't think of like the king and queen or the wealthy business people. You think of Euler and Newton. Like so who were, if you're really a scholar, you might know the wealthy people of the generation and the money they donated, or who the king or queen is, or the various nobility. So if it was like whatever Habsburg was in charge of, and Euler was also in Russia, I think under Catherine. But there would have been a whole class of like hundreds of minor nobility and hundreds of business people that that were part of the Royal Society, and you could look them up. I'm saying like they're mentioned, but historically they're not of that much note. They were just minor nobility or business people, and it's Euler that's of note. But I'm just making the point that Euler took low birth, and he was not a member of the Royal Society based on nobility or wealth. He was a member based on expertise. But now, hundreds of years later, his expertise is still important. His ideas are some of the more, the foundations of the West, and like the wealthy people that made up the Royal Society are, I don't want to say they're forgotten, because they are brought down and we do know who they are. Some of them more than others, and Euler had to educate their kids. That was part of the deal. That, like, Euler was teaching math to the kids of the nobility and business people that were also members of the Royal Society, and that's largely the same way it is today. Like if you go to the best university, you have and it's it's not directly like the Royal Society, but it's a continuation of that same system. So you have people there that are there on their expertise, and you have people there that are there based on business or nobility, and who does more. People are they're remembered for their accomplishments, and the nobility and the business class, their accomplishments aren't as great as Euler's. But I mean, all you have to do is look at Euler's Wikipedia page, and it's going to mention his financial difficulties, his parental status, and to people who understand these things, like of course it makes sense. Euler came from working class family that took education very seriously and had talent for mathematics. He was a student, I think, of Gauss himself, or maybe not, but I mean, he was recognized for his mathematical talents by the Bernoullis as
Do
a
you know
youth.
offhand if Gauss? I mean, I don't want to say he took low
It
birth.
wasn't Gauss,
I
it was
really don't like
Bernoullis.
that way of framing it. But do you know anything about his background?
I meant the Bernoullis. Gauss is later. Gauss also took like lower birth. I think his father was some sort of like Mason or something like that, and he was recognized. I mean, Gauss's famous story for solving as like a young kid how to add up all the numbers between 1 and 100. if you're familiar with that. That Gauss's teacher asked the whole class to add up all the numbers between 1 and 100, and within um, a few seconds, Gauss said 5,050, and then described how he did it. But it's saying Gauss was recognized as a youth of a talent, and he was trained in mathematics by the nobility because they recognized his talent and because they wanted to put his talent to use. So it's saying a person took high birth, um, the needs of society and the limitations of your ability. So if you recognize someone with ability, you want to groom them in order to use their talents for your benefit or society's benefit. And so people like Gauss, Euler, and Newton were in that venue and eventually became some of history's greatest figures. And saying it's telling that they took low birth and they were trained, and a lot of so the Bernoullis, um, I think, were minor nobility, and they were a family of mathematicians, but they also were part of the aristocracy. So the Bernoullis had advancements in mathematics and are still noted today as one of the greatest mathematical families. I mean, if you look on Gauss right there, like it'll tell you who his father was in these stories right on his Wikipedia page, as one of the very first things of the information. Like so, the Gauss, the first thing it says, his bio, the years he lived, the most notable accomplishments, and then straight to who his parents were. And you see there, to poor working class parents. Very first sentence in Gauss's bio, he was born to poor working class parents. His mother was illiterate and never recorded the date of his birth, remembering only that he'd been born on a Wednesday. Right, that's the first thing mentioned in Gauss's bio.
That's almost poetic.
Well, it's important saying but it's saying he was a child prodigy and he was recognized by the elites and they trained him, and he entered the institute. He became one of the greatest minds at the institute and eventually becomes one of the heads, leading people of the Royal Society, to some extent equals with kings and queens and the richest people of his generation. But everyone at the Royal Society knew that he took low birth. And even today, when you read about Gauss, the very first thing it mentions to you is how poor his parents were. You never noticed this stuff?
Figure in 100 years, if I have one of these things, the first thing I know will be my parents as well.
Well, of course. I'm saying you'll have a little, like Wikipedia, you'll have a little first paragraph that will have the years of your birth and a synopsis of your most important accomplishments. And then I'll start with your bio. And the first thing in your bio will be the bio of your parents.
Yeah.
That's just canonically, that's the way it'll be, is that, there'll be one paragraph, there'll be a synopsis of your greatest accomplishments, and then your bio, and your bio will start with the bio of your parents. There's no exception. There's no possibility there'll be any other way than that. Doesn't matter how great your accomplishments are. Doesn't matter what happens. Doesn't matter what relationship you have with your parents. That's the way your bio is going to come out.
Well, of course, if there's a standard way of writing bios, that's completely normal to expect that.
Well, yeah. So I was saying, if it's triggering, was it triggering to Gauss's whole life that every time, that it was mentioned, oh, you know how poor Gauss's parents were, and so, but I was saying it's factual, and people probably always mentioned it, and so because it was factual to him, maybe it probably didn't bother him. It's saying it made him proud, and saying however he looked at it, was just like if you're it's just factual, and to most people it's the first piece of information that people want to know who their parents are.
Sure.
But actually the first piece of information is the synopsis of the person's accomplishments, saying why do we care about Gauss. So you have a synopsis of his accomplishments, but once you care about Gauss, you want his bio, and the bio starts with who his parents are. the city that he's from and who his parents are, then the schools that he went to, like first information, who your parents were, what city you were born in, when you were born, in the schools that you went to, and your path to greatness. If you
Daryl
have a
says
path.
it's a vestigial cultural relic of a time when you either worked or went to school.
Well, I mean, till today, like, I mean, even if you look up, uh, Britney Spears or like a pop culture figure, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, it's still the same. It starts with who their parents are, where they were born, what schools they went to. I can't
Yeah.
I can't foresee anything changing in humanity, like, like maybe, the revolutionary phenotype or something, saying like he was engineered by this lab, like person X was genetically engineered by this lab.
That
There's some
sounds like X-Men.
What I was saying is that at some point in the future where it would change, and the first statement wouldn't be who your parents are and what city you were born in, where you're educated. The first statement will be that you were like engineered in this lab. I mean, that
Transhumanism,
would be,
I guess.
yeah, I'm saying that would conceivably change the standard canonization process now. That if it was possible that that it wouldn't, like, well, he didn't have parents, he was engineered in a lab.
Kind of an unsettling motif, isn't it?
But it would still have the same, saying the Wikipedia entry would still start out with like person X was engineered in this lab in this city and trained in this way.
So, society may change. We may become engineering ourselves into whatever without having
It's the
any
hero's journey.
attention, but we'll still be hung up on where we ultimately originated from in
Not
terms
hung up. It's saying
of
it's the.
country.
I mean, it's the origin. It's the most important piece of information. Like the hero's journey. What's the origin of the hero? The origin of the hero is he took birth, and he took birth.
That's the question, isn't it? Is what's the origin of the hero? That is basically the story itself.
Well, all heroes have the same origin. They took birth from a mother and a father. So I was saying, like, when you want, the very first person information. So sometimes, like, if you're doing a narrative arc and you just introduce the hero, so if it's Wikipedia or a formal biography, you start at the beginning. Sometimes, like for narrative effect, they'll start the narrative with like important parts of the life. But I have hundreds of biographies on my shelf, and almost all of them, 90% of them start with go in chronological order and start with their origin, their mother, their birth, the place that they were born.
So it sounds like you'd like to get into the academy. I think some people might say there is no such thing, and that's just something that it appears like is the case from the outside. And what would you say to that?
No, but there's clearly an academy. Like there's a university, there's the elites, um, and there's the education of the next generation. So you say, like, there's the canonized academy, like actually my friend who ran for Congress and lost is now running for the University of Michigan Board of Regents. That University of Michigan's public university, and the Board of Regents that runs the university is elected in general elections. Um, but there's universities, and generally the elite are educated in universities, and so like it's a factual academy where so to say that if I was part of the academy, I would have a class, and the people interested in the subject that I'm an expert on would come to me for training, and also leaders of society, the business class and the political class, would come to uh, come to the academy for solutions to the problems pressing society. So it's the university system was connected to the Royal Academy. I mean, the university system now is much larger than it used to be, but in essence runs the same way that the Royal Academy ran, but it's now on a much uh, delocalized method. But it's the same thing where you have a university, the people with the talent educated, and the ruling class and the business class go to the university with the pressing problems of society seeking solutions. Are you disagreeing with this? I mean to me, it's just like
Absolutely not. I'm just listening and
that's
giving
what I
it
said.
a
Like
thought, and
if
I'm
you
not
had
in a
went through
position
the
to disagree.
standardized
If,
process,
if I've never been there, I'm not in a position to disagree with your opinion. I'm
well, I
not
mean
crazy
you
about the
got
way
to
you frame
degree.
it, and it's upsetting people in the chat about the high birth, low birth, but I don't think you're intending to be offensive. It's just the way you.
Well, I say be offended. That's
Okay,
the way it is.
I'm
Whether
not.
you're
I
offended or not,
haven't
that's the
to go
way it
that
is.
far. It's more just the to get the point across. Like you're just trying to get a certain point across,
I'm
regardless.
just explaining processes in
Yeah, exactly.
reality. It's saying it's offensive to people because reality, the truth hurts to some extent. It doesn't have to, the cognitive dissonance. I think next week I'm going to write my essay on cognitive dissonance. But that's why if Jennifer had continued with her master's degree, you would have been required to teach an undergraduate class, and in your undergraduate class
Yeah.
would have been a combination of people who took children, who took higher birth and are in the university because that's what their parents pushed them to do, versus people who had talent and directed themselves towards the academy to nurture their talent. And then you also would have had the ruling class coming to you to seek solutions to their problems. And if you were in physics and you ended up in sound, that could be the police department wanting to solve crimes, and you're saying, well, we have a bunch of sound recordings of this stuff, like, can you help us solve these solve these crimes? And so they go to the university and you use the latest technology and gadgets, and you see that the police and the government and the ruling class will take the advice of the academy. They'll come to the academy to in order to understand, to use their expertise. And no matter what field you're in, that's the case. And the business class, they'll come recruit. So if you're like, I was in civil engineering, University of Michigan's a good school. Almost all of the big companies came to recruit: Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Northern Grumman, Bechtel. All the big companies came to recruit at the university, uh, because that was where they wanted to acquire the talent for to become part of the ruling class. And
Servants
then,
of the ruling class.
well, no, I'm saying that I mean, you have to start out as an apprentice, but I mean, you even to generally, if you get hired, you get you start, you're going to get 40, 60, $80,000 a year. Then if you're alumni of University of Michigan Engineering School, you get hired generally straight into the ruling class. Like you're already going to get paid, you're already going to be middle class, you're going to have benefits, you're being groomed to be part of the ruling class. But you have to, a mentorship apprentice program that to get your PhD or something, you might have to be a servant to the ruling class. You might live on $18,000 a year, working at Starbucks, doing tutoring brats, just to survive. But once you get hired, you're already part of the ruling class. And if you get hired from these companies, it's usually like the army, it's up or out, and you're being groomed to become part of the uh, ruling class. But not only that, um, grants and research that, besides for recruiting talent, the actual professors are usually beseeched to solve problems, um, and collaborative research with the corporations. So it's not just like that they're recruiting talent to work for them, they're also seeking solutions, and they recognize the academy as the location for solutions. And for the great minds that might be able to solve these dilemmas, if from public policy uh, and governance to engineering or any field, that the business class and ruling class know the problems that they're facing and the questions without solutions, and will seek the expertise of the academy for those solutions and for the recruitment of talent to become the part of the ruling class. And that's the canonized process. It's always been that way, and it still is that way. It's unlikely to ever change.
Did you want to read your article?
Oh yeah, sure. Or do you want to read it?
Sure. I don't know that I have the updated version because I did some edits. So
I
I might
put the edits in. I mean, my thing I put on review is has all the edits except for, unfortunately, the biannual versus biannual. So that was just a typo. Biannual means twice a year, as opposed to biannual means once every 2 years. And unfortunately, I put in the review, in my chess server and my Word document, I changed it. So the only edit that's not there is it says biannual, which means twice a year, as opposed
well,
to
I can just start
biannual.
reading the one you messaged me, and the only minor typo is biannual.
I just put the review in the
The
chat. You could
actual
read.
meaning is that it's once every 6 months, right? That's how often the conference is?
No, it's once every 2 years, which is biennial, biennial, which means once every 2 years, as opposed to biannual, biannual, which means twice a year. And so
Gotcha.
Abby mentioned, I emailed that to Abby, who is Dr. Penrose's assistant or in charge of the Consciousness Center administrative, and mentioned that. You could read it from the review.
Yeah, I've got it. I'll
In fact, it'd probably take you like a good few minutes. So while you're reading, I'm going to chop up a mango.
all right. The hero's journey in music and chanting. Is this the right one?
No,
I
the
feel
one I
like
just
it's
put
not
in
the
the
right one.
chat. The one I just put in the chat.
I just
Science.
think the one that you messaged me on.
You want to mess on? I just put in the YouTube chat. Get
Okay,
review.
I got it. Science of Consciousness Conference and Penrose Hammer of Hypothesis. This week was the biannual Science of Consciousness Conference in Tucson, Arizona. Jennifer and I attended remotely. Our very first stream over 3 years ago covered the Penrose Hammer hypothesis, and the science of consciousness has been a main topic of our Sunday night week in review ever since. Although my interest in consciousness is mixed between spirituality and science, I've always tried to ground my beliefs in science, recognizing that the spiritual and scientific approaches don't always lead to the same conclusions, necessitating a multidisciplinary approach. All right. As I mentioned in my essay on multiple truth hypothesis, MTH, interfaith was the main motivation in my formulation, wrestling with various traditions' understanding of the end of days, comparative eschatology, and cosmology. Many of the same problems of conflicting theories exist in science, especially consciousness studies requiring an interdisciplinary approach. Historically, consciousness studies were part of theology and philosophy. Only in the last century, advancements in physics, biology, computer science, and technology allow a more scientific approach, leaving us with thousands of years of understanding of consciousness coded into religious and philosophical language, not always corresponding with the latest scientific developments. In this week's essay, I will give a brief history of the Science of Consciousness Conference, a hard problem of consciousness, orchestrated objective reduction, and how multidisciplinary studies are advancing our understanding of consciousness. Hopefully justifying the need for Jennifer and my approach on Week in Review. Oh yeah, that was one of my edits right there. So nice. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist with a fascination about the nature of consciousness, is the main driver behind the conference. Although the conference travels around the world, it is regularly hosted by the University of Arizona, where Dr. Hameroff is the head of the Center for Consciousness Studies. In 1987, Dr. Hameroff wrote Ultimate Computing, detailing biomolecular mechanism that may give rise to consciousness, most notably microtubules. In 1991, Hameroff helped organize a conference on consciousness with mostly academics from Arizona. In 1994, he created the now biannual Science of Consciousness Conference, recruiting some of the greatest thinkers and researchers on consciousness around the globe. Early participants included David Chalmers, Benjamin Libet, Roger Penrose, and more. Over the decades, a wide array of experts has joined, discussing research related to consciousness, to an even wider array of attendees interested in the subject, including an appeal to people with more spiritual leanings and topics, such as the effects of psychedelics. 30 years later, the conference is still growing, as is the interest in the subject, leading me to sign up and join the conference myself. I'll briefly go over the hard problem of consciousness and the development of the Hameroff-Penrose hypothesis. David Chalmers in 1995, Facing Up to the Hard Problem of Consciousness, and 1996, Conscious Mind, outlines the difficulties in producing a scientific understanding of how consciousness can arise from the physical, referred to as the hard problem of consciousness. Questioning why and how we have qualia, or phenomenal experiences. Easy problems of consciousness deal with how the brain integrates information, categorizes, and discriminates environmental stimuli, focuses attention, and the various qualia, individual aspects of consciousness. Most study of consciousness centers around explaining various single aspects of consciousness, referred to as qualia. As a full model of consciousness is far beyond the ability of the current state of science to explain, and more difficult than solving a bunch of easy problems on consciousness. An explanatory gap exists between our understanding of the biological mechanism and the phenomenon of our experiences, even for single qualia. There are many approaches to the easy problems of consciousness. The approaches that propose all conscious experience can be reduced to physical mechanisms, mainly of the brain, are referred to as reductionists, whereas non-reductionists like Chalmers hold that consciousness is more complex than can be simply explained to arise from physical mechanisms. One extreme school of reductionism is eliminative materialism, which holds that consciousness and most mental states don't actually exist, just illusions of the mind. Possibly supporting eliminative materialism in the 1980s, Benjamin Libet's ingenious studies showing unconscious neural processes proceed and potentially cause volition retrospectively felt to be conscious motivation. Most leading experts in the science of consciousness are materialists, but not eliminative materialists. Francis Crick in 1994 wrote the astonishing hypothesis, positing a person's mental activity are entirely due to the behavior of nerve cells, glial cells, and the atoms, ions, and molecules that make them up and influence them, proposing that further scientific investigations will discover how the physical gives rise to consciousness. The majority of research in consciousness studies is searching for and explaining an explanation of the physical mechanisms of consciousness. The two main schools of materialism are neural correlates of consciousness and integrated information theory. The neural correlates of consciousness is an empirical approach using a minimal set of neuronal events and mechanisms sufficient for specific conscious precept. Research centers around correlating various conscious phenomena with neural activity using the latest technologies to measure brain activity. Multiple tests correlating specific conscious events with neural events using the scientific process give rise to models on consciousness, aiming to answer some of the easy problems. Leading proponent of neural correlates of consciousness is Christoph Koch, the president of the Allen Institute of Brain Sciences. Institutes around the world continually produce new studies of various neural correlates to facets of consciousness. Integrated information theories and other popular framework of consciousness it's another popular framework for why physical systems are conscious, working backwards, trying to understand consciousness through the minimal biological building blocks required to produce conscious experience. All materialist schools face the explanatory gap, explaining how physical properties give rise to the way things feel when they're experienced. Other schools include New Mysterianism, including Flanagan and Chomsky, as opposed to the old Mysterians who were dualists and thought consciousness cannot be understood scientifically because it operates according to non-natural principles, framing consciousness not as a hard problem that might eventually be solved, but a mystery that will always cause wonder. And you might need to take a break because this is quite long. Do you want to take over from here? I'm not really used to reading out loud so much.
Okay, yeah, sure. It's good practice.
Yeah, I feel like I'm about to start making a lot of mistakes, and I don't want to do that. So I also want to give a brief overview, if you don't mind taking over.
Which paragraph did you get to? You finished the hard problem of consciousness. You finished the two main schools.
I'm the one right after Mysterianism.
Okay. So I also give a brief overview of objective orchestrated reduction, OR, the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis. That is one of the main areas of study related to the Science of Consciousness conference. As mentioned in 1987, Stuart Hameroff wrote Ultimate Computing, giving an overview of biomolecular mechanisms for consciousness, specifically microtubules. Concurrently, Roger Penrose in 1989 wrote The Emperor's New Mind, discussing how quantum effects might give rise to consciousness. Quantum mechanics is complicated by the famous measurement problem related to Schrodinger's equation and the collapse of the wave function. Dassey and Penrose had forwarded an objective collapse theory to the measurement problem centering around gravity, as opposed to multi-world theories. In The Emperor's New Mind, Penrose posits that consciousness is non-algorithmic, invoking theory, suggesting that due to the limits of the incompleteness theory, mathematicians must be using some non-computable process, most likely the waveform collapse. Stuart Hameroff, after reading Penrose's Emperor's New Mind, informed Penrose of the possibility that microtubules might be the mechanism that consciousness utilizes for the waveform collapse. In 1994, Penrose wrote Shadows of the Mind, updating his theory with Hameroff suggesting creating the Hameroff's suggestion, creating the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis, objective orchestrated reduction, positing consciousness is based on non-computable quantum processes performed by qubits on microtubules amplified by neurons. Decades later, Penrose-Hameroff is one of the leading models of consciousness, with countless researchers adding new discoveries every year. Despite the best efforts of great minds, the explanatory gap remains, and the hard problem of consciousness is unanswered, with regular progress is made solving some of the easy problems. The nature of consciousness studies requires interdisciplinary studies, and the few places dedicated to consciousness studies try to bring together experts from diverse fields, many times housed in medical schools, usually related to anesthesiology, sleep studies, and psychology, fields that require accurate understanding of consciousness using the scientific method. However, historically, consciousness is a subject of philosophy and theology. Our lexicon describing consciousness comes from the dualistic heritage, focusing on the mind-body problem, assuming that consciousness derives from the soul and is not limited to the restraints of natural law. Theologians and religious scholars have a long tradition of consciousness studies, prayer, and meditation that predate the scientific method, more based on introspection and sage wisdom. Advancements in our understanding of consciousness uses the best of all approaches and an integrated approach. Difficulties arise in the extreme expertise required to understand the subdisciplines such as quantum mechanics, neuroscience, brain anatomy, as well as the historical canon of philosophy and theology related to consciousness. In coming essays, I will go more into detail into some of the models of consciousness, the historical canon of wisdom, and how the multiple truth hypothesis can help students navigate all the various and sometimes mutually incompatible theories.
Yeah, because I'm glad you took my notes on changing, because just like in terms of framing, we don't necessarily want to presume that they're contradicting each other. Because a contradiction, to me, it ought to mean something. So maybe it's possible that there would be something that would be technically a contradiction, but a paradigm level incompatibility contradiction, I actually have trouble believing that that would be likely.
Where the axiomatic contradictions, such as that, is the dualistic model of
That's what I'm saying.
consciousness.
Dualism, in my understanding, isn't a contradiction of non-dualism
Yeah, but
because
because
there's non-zero overlap.
you're already advancing a specific school of Hinduism that's saying something different than mainstream dualist. Like as opposed to saying the historical canon as it is, you're saying a specific school that has their own slant on it, and uh, and you just keep on repeating that. But I'm saying classical dualism uh, posits that the non-physical realm that contains consciousness does not operate according to natural law. So if you have like a pantheist, or however you want to describe it, view where you want to claim that the realm of consciousness operates according to natural law, you're in contradiction to the majority of dualistic schools that hold that the spiritual realm does not operate, does not bound by natural law. If you just want to put it like as a straight contradiction, either consciousness operates according to natural law or it doesn't. And
What if it
so,
creates natural law?
but I said now you're advancing your own theory or
I'm asking
understanding.
which one of your it falls into if that's the case.
That's a school of dualism, and I mentioned this many times.
So if consciousness causes material, then that's dualism. Or sorry, if consciousness causes natural law, you're saying that's dualism. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying.
No, I mean that's more monism. Dualism is just saying that there's two separate realms: a physical realm that is subject to natural law, and a non-physical realm of which consciousness is part of that is not subject to natural law. Whether the so to say, the non called the spiritual realm gives rise to the material realm or not is not fundamental to dualism. Some dualistic schools hold that the spiritual realm gives rise to the physical realm. Some schools of dualism holds that they're independent and function and interact, but one doesn't give rise to the other. So if you're part of a school that you're either monistic or holds that the spiritual realm gives rise to the material realm, that's a specific school, as opposed to your just classical dualism that has a variety of schools that may or may not posit that the spiritual realm gives rise to the material realm. So you always jump straight into like saying what you're saying, and I understand what you're saying, but I'm just trying to frame it that the majority of dualistic schools don't necessarily say that the spiritual realm gives rise to the material realm.
I was not asking that at
And so
all.
saying you're like, I'm saying it's a contradiction. It's like, no, it's not a contradiction because the spiritual realm gives rise to the material realm. And saying that's one way of looking at it. The people who try to reconcile the contradiction, as opposed to just saying there's a contradiction there, because consciousness studies is trying to use the scientific method and natural law to understand the process of consciousness. And from a dualistic point of view, he's saying that will fail because consciousness doesn't operate according to natural law.
Okay. Cool. I
Mm.
have said something similar. I don't know if it's the same thing. Basically, like that science can't be philosophy because it's a particular application of philosophy. So it's like erroneous to try to make it one. Anyway, it's maybe not the same exact thing.
When it comes to like mathematics, if or logic, you say logic is a subfield of philosophy, and science is dependent upon logic. And then how you look into mathematics is science is dependent on mathematics, and mathematics is a subfield of philosophy. Or if you're going to try to claim that mathematics is in the realm of science, but I'm saying like historically, most people understand that logic is part of philosophy, and science necessitates philosophy because it necessitates logic. That you can't you have science without logic, and the origins of logic can't be found in science itself.
Boolean logic, you mean?
Well, logic of any form. I don't mean. Aristotle wrote a book on. Logic predates Aristotle even, but I mean, Boole was only 150 years ago. Saying logic in general. Boolean logic is the origin of circuit logic. But I'm saying logic in general.
I'm not aware of any distinction between those two.
Between what?
Between what people mean when they say logic and what they mean when they say Boolean logic. I don't see a difference.
Boolean logic, application of logic to circuit logic in binary. Boolean logic takes the existing field of logic and derives the principles of logic from circuit logic
They're self-referential, I know.
They're not self-referential. Saying Boolean logic isn't logic. Boolean's logic is a method of creating logical circuits. The logic, Boolean didn't develop logic. He used pre-existing logic and just adapted it into circuit logic.
Aristotelian logic.
Well, it wasn't just Aristotelian. I was saying Aristotle wrote a whole book on logic already 2,300 years ago. And most of the logic we have today is largely in accordance with Aristotle, but it's been adapted and changed, and obviously. And saying Boole didn't advance new developments in logic; he applied the logic to circuits.
Right. So Boolean logic is an implementation of Aristotelian logic.
Well, of the canon of, because it's not pure Aristotelian. The Aristotelian logic isn't canonized like that. Logic has developed over centuries. When I'm saying logic is an old field, it goes back to the Greeks. Logic is a Greek word and was developed by the Greeks. And mathematics largely derives from logic.
I would totally disagree with you on that. If we're using the current definition of logic, which is Boolean logic, mathematics doesn't come from Boolean logic.
I don't know what you're saying. I don't know how you brought in Boolean. Because I was talking about Boolean logic. I don't know how you're talking about Boolean logic.
How do you go from logic to mathematics is my question.
Boolean logic is more to do with computation and programming.
You just said math, you get it from logic. I'm asking how.
Logic is the structure of deriving conclusions from postulates. So in mathematics,
not a lot of evidence. I'm saying literally walk me through logic that gets you to math, because I don't see it. I know this gets asserted a lot. I just honestly don't see the connection. Would love to, but don't see the connection.
Mathematics has logical presuppositions.
Again, how?
Like the fundamental axioms, like equals, the associative rule, the basic fundamental proposition, like the transitive and the associative property that are based on logic and our assumptions.
Here's the thing: you can't go from Boolean logic to calculus. You need something else.
Well, you can go from Boolean logic to calculus.
Really? Pretty ballsy assertion. So you can imagine why I wouldn't be convinced when there's absolutely no evidence to support it. It's just a completely unverified assertion that logic is the foundation of mathematics, when clearly geometry is the foundation of mathematics. Logic, as it's currently understood, has very little to do with mathematics, as it's currently understood, aside from computers, which is Boolean logic.
Well, I mean, even geometry operates according to logical structures.
Assertion with no evidence that I
Wait a
would
minute,
definitely.
Euclid, the first book on uh, mathematics, the concept of axioms and
It's not the
conclusions
first book
is
on mathematics, but okay.
illogical structures. To assume that you have postulates and that the rules could be derived from postulates is logic.
You can keep saying it's logic, but if you don't demonstrate it, it starts to sound a little odd.
Well, because we're really just talking Greek etymology.
We're
I
talking
mean,
about what is the foundation of what here, and there's a massive gap in understanding, and I think we're closing in on it. So I'm actually really glad we're
well, I
having.
mean, you just want like a Greek lesson. I mean, like you're just asking for a Greek lesson.
You're making assertions that are not good dated back to the Greeks because they didn't mean the same thing by logic. Hegel didn't even mean the same thing by logic as what's meant in the modern day.
All these are Greek words. Mathematics, geometry, logic are all Greek words.
I know that. That doesn't mean that our current understanding is based on exactly templated on what the Greeks understood. There's a connection in the term, but not necessarily the meaning. And if everyone was a Platonist, quote unquote, back then, you can argue that we don't even have any capacity to understand things the same way that they did. But yeah, this assertion that logic underlies math, I don't see it. I think geometry underlies math, and I don't see a link from logic to geometry. So if someone wants to go ahead and prove that or establish it, then I'll be cool with it. But right now, it just seems like a wishful thinking thing, and that's not a good way to go forward with an actual understanding. And I see there's comment in the chat about everything is computation. It's like if that's true, then it's probably only true for like one definition of computation. Then you're right back to the hard problem of consciousness is interpreting measurements and trying to divide yourself out of the measurements that you're taking.
Well, if you look, maybe the Wikipedia to say a narrow definition of logic is the science of deductively valid inferences.
It's not about what is asserted, it's about what's demonstrated. I'm saying process. Show me the process that goes from that to calculus. I'm interested, but calculus, as far as I understand, requires an infinity. It is not clear to me how
I
that
mean,
type of
if you
logic
take,
can get to an infinity. That's what I'm wondering, essentially. Well, among
if
other
you
things.
take, I mean, either way, logic is the source of, I mean, if you take the pure Greek logos, like E. Michael Jones, logos is reason or language itself. And so that geometry and mathematics are both dependent upon logos, language. That geometry necessitates logic, language to describe. You can't have geometry without language.
Um, I
Okay,
might
so
disagree, but that's a complete
definitionally,
inversion of the original
mathematics
meaning of what
and
we were saying.
geometry are dependent on logos,
Clearly,
language.
are you trying to establish that the definitions of these terms have changed over time or the meaning has changed? And in that case, I would agree with you.
Well, I mean, we get into some of these stupid arguments where you just go into circular word games and playing around with the meaning of words. So if you're like the history, the etymology, or you want to give a strict definition. So I'm saying the logic from the original Greek logos in that has a strict translation as language.
Okay. My
And
question
saying
was, why don't you go from logic to math?
that
And you're saying it's just the
mathematics
thing that
and
happens. And I'm saying I don't
geometry,
see the link. And you're saying I'm
mathematics
playing a word
and
game. I
geometry
don't
are
understand.
a logos. They are a language.
Math is a language.
And geometry is a language.
Does that make sense?
I mean, you could possibly create some sort of hypothesis where you have a language independent geometry and mathematics, and maybe you drive, and if you're just going to play some stupid word games, it's just
I
going to be a
am
pointless.
not playing a
It's
stupid
just going to be
word
a
game. I'm
pointless
going into
argument
this
that
stuff
doesn't
with
get
you
anywhere.
as a colleague, and I'm respecting your scholastic interest. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence at all. This is what the discussion requires. So please don't misunderstand my intention here. I don't think that you or necessarily anyone has the answer, but if we want to get to a deeper understanding, we need to make meaningful inroads in closing the gap in understanding. between computation, calculation, and observation. That's kind of what I was getting at. Not to get into a quibble with you or anything.
Yeah, I would put it like logic is higher order rules, and mathematics and geometry necessitate the existence of higher order rules. That you can't have mathematics or geometry if there's no higher order rules, and the higher order rules, that's logic. If you want to get biblical,
And then it's a question of what is the higher or what are the higher order rules? And then it's a question of interpretation.
one of the higher order rules, whatever they are, that's what's referred to as logic, logos. So
But then
like in
there's
the book
also
of John,
colloquial definitions of logic arise.
in the beginning, logos was with God, and the word was logos. That logos is the origin of higher order rules, and disciplines like geometry and mathematics necessitate the existence of higher order rules, and those higher order rules, that's what I'm referring to by the word logic.
So not the three laws of thought.
Well, the categories saying what logic is, you have saying what is logic. I was saying the broad definition, logic is higher order rules. Fundamental, fundamental rules. If you want to put it down to one word, like logic is language.
But does that
wisdom comes in the form of language? You can't have mathematics or geometry without a language to express it in. And that language that mathematics
I don't think that
and
that's
geometry is expressed in is the language of logic.
I don't think either of those things is the fact.
Well, in fact, I mean, we're just definitions. If you want to define it differently, go ahead and define it differently. But that's how I'm understanding it. That's
well, you're saying there's a line from logic to math. I'm saying there isn't.
I'm not saying a line. I'm saying logic, math, geometry are sub-disciplines of logic.
Another assertion with no evidence, no actual path other than to say logic is abstract principles of language, and then you're basically saying nothing.
Well, I'm saying logic is language itself.
So why not just use the term language? Why not just leave logic out of it altogether then and just use the term language?
That's the strict translation of logic is language.
So do you think we might need a more nuanced understanding to progress the understanding forward?
Well, I understand. If you want a strict definition of logic, it's language. And saying that mathematics, geometry is expressed in language, logic.
No, it's expressed in images and diagrams. That's what geometry is, forms.
That's language. Images and diagrams are language.
Assertion with no evidence. I can easily say forms pre-exist language. You can't disprove that.
Forms, I'm saying forms are language. It's part of the category.
You can just keep asserting that everything is a language, but then you have to say, well, what's a language? And you have no answer because you've just said everything is this thing. And well, if everything is a thing, how specific can you really be?
Well, that's how I'm defining the term logic, is this pre-supplemented category that is used to describe other categories. You want to call, inclusive language, not just like the English language, but symbolic language like mathematics. And that's why today mathematics is written in Greek letters. That mathematics is basically Greek, the Greek alphabet.
So is JavaScript a language?
Well, yeah, I mean, everything is expressed in language, from symbolic language to communicative language to oral language, and I mean, that's why we use Greek for logic today. I mean, for mathematics, for geometry, that all of the symbolic representation of geometric and mathematical ideas is Greek.
Isn't it the Pythagorean theorem? I've got the definition up here. Study of correct reasoning or good arguments. So that is very broad. I haven't read this, but it's clear to me that the definition has changed from just purely a language to a process and a method of reasoning.
When we go down to etymology, I mean, that's the generic understanding, and just like a person that has its main uses, and then it starts with its history. So the first section is usually the etymology and the history of the word. You see, logos, logic comes from the Greek logos, that is translated as either reason or language.
Right. So is there a difference between reason and logic?
That's the definition of the word. The etymology of the word logic, reason, or language. The laws of thought. Logic is traditionally defined as the study of the laws of thought or correct reasoning.
I thought there were no unqualified aunts.
I mean, you just haven't studied the Greeks, and I say it's like the whole canonization of mathematics, geometry, they're all Greek words.
But were the Greeks right? I.e., is math a language as we currently understand a language?
Well, they're right enough today that you're speaking Greek. When you want to talk about these subjects, you talk Greek.
So, no, then.
I mean, I said that's my point. The sages, the very lexicon that we use to describe these things, you could try creating your own definitions or your own concepts. We're saying that if there's some first order of rules, that's what we refer to as logic. And if you like a second order of rules based on that logic, could be things like the various language that would include geometry, mathematics, but geometry and mathematics necessitates whatever the first principles of logic are. Not
So
the other
just
way
shoving
around.
logic in where it's not required or even
It's
sensible.
just definitional. It's not shoving in. It's definitional. It's how the word's defined to mean. So if you have some other system and you want to try to explain something different than the Greeks, but this is how the Greeks laid it out. And
That
the
is not
canon.
the current meaning of the term, though.
I mean, do an etymology. It's like if you're giving your own understanding as opposed to, what do you mean that's not the current understanding?
Well, what is the average person thinking of when they hear the word logic?
They probably assume reason. Logic is like the meaning of logic is reason. Mathematics and geometry is based on reason.
So reason and logic is the same thing. So why have two different words? My point is that the definition of this term, English and Greek, they're not necessarily mutually intercompatible languages. And so there's like an ancient meaning and then there's a current meaning. And are you suggesting that that meaning hasn't changed since the Greeks?
Well, I mean, reason is Latin. So if you say, how do you define logic? So it's saying reason, that's a Latin word, and the Latin word reason comes from the word ratio.
Okay. I don't know what that actually solves, but or what that actually tells us.
Well, I'm saying that I mean, you're talking about um, the word slipping me. You were using it the other day, but um, I mean, like the Buddhist emptiness school, where you just have uh, your words don't really have definition; they just have relational definition. So it's saying, what does logic mean? Logic means reason. What does reason mean? Reason means ratio. What does ratio mean? Ratio means possibly counting.
Proportional measurement inference.
So it's just going to be
The
circular.
proportional measurement inference. It's like if I know there's a ratio of 1 to 30 in a map, then I can just multiply whatever thing on centimeters by 30. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so just circular where you're defining words in relation to other words.
Um, it's always circular to varying degrees, and the level of circularity, the different lessons are at the different levels of circularity. You're saying I only want linear lessons. I'm saying, well, those are the ones where the circularity, the circle's so big that you can't, that it seems flat. And I'm saying you might want some actual circular lessons that are more circular to understand where the issues and limitations are with language so that you don't end up in what is accurately described as a semantic argument. But this is not a semantic argument. This is a process relational argument about whether logic underlies math process relationally. And the answer is that it does not in the current understanding of the term logic. Perhaps in the historical understanding, yes, if you make it definitionally so that reason is just this abstract thing that means thinking about stuff, sure. But there's a question of what arises first and what can exist and subsist in the absence of other things. And a nebulously defined term that's self-referential and suppositional in its very nature and in interfering with a process relation that may exist in its absence, I fail to see the utility of that in the goal of pedagogy.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if you're getting it or if you're even advancing anything. I would put it, you're saying math is the logic of numbers, geometry is the logic of shape. They're both
Then just
subdisciplines
replace it
of
with
logic.
measurement. Replace it with measurement, and what do you lose?
Why? Because logic is more than measurement.
What is it more than measurement?
It's the language.
Again, I'm not seeing an actual anything. It's just empty words to me. This doesn't affect the process, is my point.
Yeah, but so you're just diverting to a separate theological question about the nature of meaning, and it's like, well, maybe nothing has a meaning, and so it has nothing. It's as
No,
far
in
as
this
saying
way, in this case, it's quite
that you're
literally
not having a
asserted meaning
conversation
with
about
no
math
basis,
or
and it's
logic. You're
self-referential and
diverting
its
to
own
the same
supposition.
conversation about meaning in general. So you're not advancing the conversation. You're saying, well, in order to understand this, we have to understand meaning in general, and so it's not really advancing anything.
Not meaning in general, limitations to understanding that come in with the fuzzy boundaries of definitions of terms associated with the dependent arising. How's a mango? I guess Doovid's looking up some stuff, and
I just muted
I've
because
come
I
up with
was eating the
question a
mango,
lot.
but maybe we should just wrap up. We're just going to get into some circular logic about the meaning of words again. It's a sign to just wrap up.
I did a Darien theorem. I don't know if you're interested in that.
Well, I'm eating the mango, but I'm taking that when we, deteriorate into these circular arguments about the meaning of words. It's a good sign to just wrap up. But I'll keep on eating my mango if
And
you want to.
eventually, maybe you'll understand that all philosophical conversations sound like this, and that there's no reason to give up just because they sound like this. But
Why don't give
as
up and
that
saying
day is
just
not today.
repetitive isn't not advancing anything. It's just the
I'm
repetition
saying that there
of a
needs to be
similar
a gap
argument.
in the understanding of logic and mathematics, because right now you're saying, well, they're a language, they're a language, they're a language, and that's not actually clarifying what any of that means.
Yeah, so there's so if you just want to, so we're just repeating another argument that we've had before and not advancing anything. So it's like, okay, let's repeat this argument again. So saying we don't need to repeat it. That they could just go back and replay any of the hundreds of times we've had this repetitive argument. It's not advancing anything. So if we can't have some sort of common lexicon to advance a conversation, and just going to divulge to this repetitive circular argument on the, where you will call the nature of meaning. It's just designed to wrap up. We're not advancing anything because we can't agree to some sort of common lexicon.
Okay, well, look forward to hearing your next thoughts about what you're going to write about.
I'll probably write next week on cognitive dissonance.
Great. Yeah, that'll be cool. I've written extensively on that. And
I don't necessarily wrap up. I don't want to get into these circular argument about the meaning of words. Like if we can't agree to some sort of common lexicon,
we can
um,
agree. We can definitely agree. I'm not saying I even disagree with you. All I'm saying is let's start with saying there's an issue with understanding between what is logic and what is mathematics. That's where there's a problem. And I don't know what the problem is exactly or how to phrase it.
yeah, but you
And
don't have scholarship.
at this
So I'm
point,
saying, so it's like if you have, so I mean, you're right. There's a problem, but you don't actually have scholarship to advance it. So either you have your own theory that you can't articulate, or you can articulate and then articulate it, but you don't actually have scholarship to it to advance any conversation.
scholarship in the domain of talking about closing the gap between words that have been continuously changing meaning for 2,500 years.
Yeah, so that would be the scholarship where you know the history and the etymology of these ideas, which that's what you don't have. So you can't advance. You could, either you don't appear to have the ability to express your own ideas if you have them. So I mean, if you give you the benefit of the doubt that you actually have your own ideas, you don't have the lexicon to describe it, and you don't have the scholarship on the history of the idea. So there's really nothing there. There's no content. You know, see what I'm
We've had a
saying?
lot of fun topics covered today.
So you have to do your homework to have content, and the homework either is the Greeks or something. You guys actually have to do the research of the history of these ideas to have good content. Okay, so I guess we'll wrap it up, and um, not much on the coming up. I still might reach out to John David Ebert and try to talk about the hero's journey. So maybe I'll email him this week and invite him on my channel to talk about Campbell and the hero's journey. I reached out to this uh, person who wrote a book on Detroit and maps. He's got a webpage, Detroitography, and a whole bunch of maps of Detroit showing various things. So if he uh, is willing to do an interview, I'll have him on my channel uh, and talk about Detroit and his book on trying to understand Detroit through 100 different maps. He wrote a book of 100 different maps, showing trying to show different features of Detroit. So it's remotely possible that will be this week, but it's unlikely I'll have any content um, this week. So Science of Consciousness went on, doing a lot of research. I pulled a bunch of math books. In fact, here I have um, some books I pulled out: Set Theory, The Theory of Numbers. Here, First Order Logic, um, Number Theory, Visual Complex Analysis, The Little Book of Primes, and Proofs. And I pulled out another few books. I actually pulled out, uh, I'll show these real quick just because we're talking about it. And that's why I said, like, good content takes scholarship. You got to do your homework. So,
Doooovid has temporarily walked away from the screen. Not sure if he's coming back. Oh, there he is. Don't want to leave any dead air there.
here is a first course in logic. I put this already on my desk. So these, I have two desks, but so this is in my immediate queue. A first course in logic. Introduction to the Theory of Sets. Here's actually Richard Feynman, Quantum Mechanics and the Path Integrals. How to prove it. And proofs from the book. So these are math books in my immediate queue. So I said, like, the scholarship, got to do the research to have what to present. So hopefully I'm going to start these books this week and finish them over the next few weeks. And then in my next queue, I have more books, and I still have my big stack of math books. And at the same time, I'm reading other stuff. So hopefully we'll have good stuff to keep people posted and keep the research going. So have a great week, and feel free to ramble, and I'll try to watch back either tomorrow or the next day, whatever you say after I sign off.
Thanks for joining. So I've noticed a lot of assertions in the chat and no demonstrations. Why would I care? Just think about that. Why ought I give a shit? If I'm trying to make things as simple as possible, why ought I complicate them in what appear to be unnecessary ways? So, I had a recent theory that's, wondering what percent of current understanding of math comes out of the Pythagorean theorem? And what is even the Pythagorean theorem telling us? And I've been sort of racking my memory banks about, did anyone actually ever derive the Pythagorean theorem? And did they justify it? And on what basis did they justify it? So it's interesting. And I just thought, for fun, if I could derive it using a minimum number of assertions, because the inspiration came out of being shared this article about something Hegel said that I honestly didn't really understand. And I don't know if I still have it up. I shared it at the beginning. Here it is. Yeah, it was about the Pythagorean theorem. Is it supposed to be some deity or something? I'm not sure. It kind of just reads as like something someone wrote who didn't understand math very well. But I think it gets to the root of the issue with being exceedingly restricted in how you understand mathematics, and then having this like theological consciousness, blah, 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 everything all mixed up, and understanding. It's extremely complicated. So, sure, understanding that words had different meanings in the past, that's important. But then to think we could relate to it, we're kind of in the region where, remember when Doowovid was talking about how the celebrities were cyclic almost, and how like one generation didn't really remember anything past a certain point, blah, blah, blah. That happens on probably much finer gradient or longer scale with meaning of words. And even a word like, take something like infinity. Is it possible for our understanding of that term to change? Well, absolutely. And especially when you have something like calculus that requires, within the process of doing calculus, to actually invoke infinity. That is going to get you thinking about infinity in a particular way, is going to give you baggage conceiving of infinity associated with calculus. So I will go on with my demonstration so that we can see like what sort of that I'm getting at, maybe, hopefully, in terms of presuppositionalism, because a lot of these thinkers are edging towards the interpretation that math physics is some objective thing. That's definitely appealing. Of course, it would be great to have moral license, but just wanting moral license and having that being your fundamental assumption is moral license. Yeah, well, that's the kind of evil thing. Deceiving yourself to saying absolute things that really aren't absolute. That's also kind of not great. So we've got infinite reflection, and reflection of right triangles to reproduce their exact determination within themselves is the proof of their concept. Well, no, it's not. that doesn't actually demonstrate anything. Because in terms of a proof of concept for something like this, you want to be looking at it like, why do we need to conceive of circles? Why do we need to conceive of perpendicular lines? Do we really need the perpendicular lines to extend, or the parallel lines to extend in perpetuity? Does that have meaning? Does a straight line even have meaning in the context of what we can measure? Seems like, unfortunately, a lot of people refuse to ask those questions because they're just too busy doubling down on their previous beliefs to which they are dogmatically, rigidly, puritanically attached. I actually made a video of this, so I might just play it now. And whoopsie. All right. I thought I had it pulled up, but maybe I've got it on the other one. Ah, here we go.
The diagram consists of an emitter undergoing vibration of average amplitude x0 in a direction maximally deviated from that of the associated emission. Each side of the equation is squared such that all resulting values are positive, in accordance with a necessary positive value of time. The time of a signal originating from the point of average variation along the direction of the axis of vibration, x0, and extending towards the detector along the geodesic, x2, is experimentally indistinguishable from the sum of the time of the average vibrational variation, t of x0, and the time of signal displacement in the direction of the axis of the detector, t of x1. Consider a signal originating at the tip of the amplitude of the average vibrational variation and traveling along the geodesic towards the detector. This is the hypotenuse geodesic, or hypotenuse, associated with the vibrational variation. Definitionally, the time interval associated with the formation of the hypotenuse geodesic is indistinguishable from the sum of the time of the average variational amplitude and the time of the signal displacement in the direction of the axis of the detector. The equations c equals delta x over delta t may be arranged to give delta t equals delta x over c. The given formulation does not disinclude negative values, and so each side of the equation is squared. This excludes the possibility of negative values of time. By the distributive property of multiplication over addition, we have three possible results. The first, or non-commutative expansion, these central terms, resulting from the multiplication, are not equal to each other. That is, delta x0 is non-commutative over delta x1. And so the equation has 5 unknowns. The second case is the commutative expansion. Here, the central term is not 0, but each of the central terms are equal. And so the equation reduces to 4 unknowns. Finally, we have the Euclidean limit, where the central terms are equal to 0. This is the familiar Pythagorean theorem, where the product of x0 and x1 is 0, which is always the case for the dot product of perpendicular vectors. And so we can recover the Pythagorean theorem as a limit of an experimentally inferred observational temporal indistinguishability principle, namely between the hypotenuse time and the sum of the times of the average emitter vibration and displacement in the direction of the detector.
All right, so that was my attempt at, I wanted to do something that didn't require anything connected to parallel lines. So just to recap, parallel lines and perpendicular lines within the Euclidean paradigm are dependent concepts because a perpendicular line is 90 degrees and an angle. It's where all those triangle rules come from. You know what's funny? Daryl is upset that I squared a term instead of absolute valuing it, coming back to his constant conceptual gah. um, yeah. What's the definition of the absolute value operator? So we're not just looking at what operators are theoretically defined here. We're talking about if we're going to construct operators, what are the minimum, what's the minimal presuppositional structure? Hint, non-trivial self-reference, information density, super packed. Okay. So see if I can bring that up. Okay, yeah, exactly. It's like I understand what you're acting like I don't know what the absolute value function is. The point of the derivation is to not even have to define an absolute value function. So here I haven't defined a number system. And that's not a bad thing because you want your thing to work in any number system. So that, and I have minimum presuppositions. So you show me literally any other solution, I'm going to be able to find more than what I have listed here, which is 5, arguably 6. Okay. And one of those things is that time is larger than 0. And that's something I was arguing a couple, some time ago and probably in the future as well about whether it means something for time to be able to go backwards. And now I'm obviously not quoting that perfectly, but it's really not defined. And that's because there's a dimensional neutrality that obliterates the possibility for backwards flow of time, quote unquote, to be possible. Even if it seems like it ought to be possible, that's actually a subjective artifact. So really, there is an element. Okay, there are tons of techniques that involve training and channeling and mastering and so forth, the intuitions. But we're fundamentally in a domain that is absolutely not expected for what's said to be intuitive. If anything, it's going to be counterintuitive because what it's doing is starting to remove a subjective bias. And how can we do that? Well, thinking from first principles, what does that mean? How many things do I need to assume before I can get to this conclusion that I know from its utility it has some meaning that seems objective? Whether that's the thing doesn't really matter, but in the quest to justify utility, it's the inductive problem again. Well, how do we make incursions? Well, maybe you can't within a secular worldview make absolute incursions, but you can relatively say, well, this is simpler metaphysically than that if you can decompose things into an axiomatic, what I would call an axiomatic inference model, i.e. list of presumptions, list of allowable relations between the presumptions, and then emulate those states until you reach the steady state. So all that to say that multiplying something by itself in every system gives a positive number, except for the negative or the I, the imaginary number. Now that's not an issue in my system because I understand through studying history that I came about in order to have solutions to the eigenvector decomposition of rotation matrices. And I don't have that issue because I simply axiomatize the rotation matrices as invertible because space is absolutely 100% non-dual when it comes to spatial preference. Although, so the example on that is there's no top in the universe. There's arguably a top in the solar system locally, okay, with the axis of the sun. That's locally. Non-locally, no. That's the difference. All right, so the issue is that when you're multiplying, when you're squaring one term, it's the thing times itself, so that's just one term. If you're squaring a sum times a sum, that starts you off with 4 terms. So how are we going to deal with all these terms that don't conform with the Pythagorean theorem. Well, we're not actually going to get rid of them. We're going to say, well, actually, these are dimensional operators. They're allowable dimensional operators because our limit is 3 plus 1 dimensional operators. So really, so far, this is only 2. X naught and X1. And we wouldn't say that X2 is another dimensional operator. Why? Dependent arising. And this comes back to the people who already know math so well, obviously. I don't need to teach them anything. What linear algebra refers to as orthogonality, which in this system is a limit case, where it makes sense to approximate space-time as flat, which is we need limit point cases because our experience is space-time. Our brain ultra flattens it. It's basically what it is, a flattener. So this higher ordered principle-based reasoning later gives flatter approximations. They both have their role because when the approximations fail, we need to know why they fail. And this is where it's a challenge now. We don't know where to start to say why they failed. We're not even at a point where people can even necessarily admit that there's a failure. So what have I done? I've just said, okay, I've got the simplest possible setup here that I could possibly do. And what does it consist of? Well, a receiver, an emitter at A, and a receiver at B. So I'm basically saying, let's say B is going to be completely stationary and I'm just doing like a limit point. Okay. Is that realistic? Well, maybe not, whatever. But when you're doing a first approximation to something completely counterintuitive, like I don't have direct intuitive access to how light vibrates the simplest possible system out there. Like, no, I have the same clunky human brain. So yeah, general step by step, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps type thing is solve the easiest version and then see in what sense is it actually a perfect metaphor, i.e. transcends the space, i.e. does this now generalize to every case of emitter, receiver along a single axis vibrating in, I'm going to say perpendicular axis, but in my system, we're not actually talking about perpendicular. We talk about maximally deviated. And the measurement limit gives us a limit of maximal deviations, which comes back to this idea of things happening as a simulation within a very tight range. Major sort of image in the theory and so forth. So what is this decomposition saying is that, well, your emitter, by virtue of being energized, okay, it's emitting light, i.e. it's energized, really nothing more complicated than that. We can expect for it to have some vibrational motion. Fair enough? Yeah, okay. So that means that it's going to be moving a little bit and then it's going to emit that light and it's really actually impossible to tell where it emitted the light from. We only know that the emission is subject to uniform probability and within a certain type of variation. That's where your statistics comes in. So I'm crap at statistics and hope to be corrected, etc. on these measurements more, as we go forward with an understanding, which is generally I just say, okay, well, that's the average. I define the vertical coordinate as the average deviation. I'm just saying, yeah, because it's energized, there's going to be some average deviation. And the sum of the time that it takes the system to deviate and the amount of time it takes for the light to get to the receiver is indistinguishable from a single time interval going from the tip of the event, which is deviated in the average sense, to that receiver, which is the hypotenuse. That plus, so at this point, note that A is 0, 0 here. So we haven't excluded negative values. So you're looking at an ultra-fast pendulum and undergoing variation between possibly negative and positive values. But we know from our experience that guess what? There is no such thing as going backwards in time or negative space. That's something maybe we can imagine. To the same extent we can imagine, like, okay, whatever the people that say the Russell's teapot stuff are alluding to in terms of like unfalsifiability. Okay, what does that tell us? Well, how do we get a positive number if we have numbers that definitionally are just as likely to be negative as positive? Now, I did situate the centroid markets A A is the centroid. But thank you for bringing that up, and I can actually show you where it says that, if you'd like. It's actually the first thing that I did. I suppose I'm annoyingly consistent that way. So what makes sense to do? Well, put the emitter at 0, 0. It probably makes just as much sense to put it at the receiver, because it's well, even maybe more sense because it's not moving. But whatever. The point is that there's a probability that it's positive or negative, and that is not allowable physically. So this system allows us to exclude possibility on a physical basis. Yay! And then the question is, well, how do I guarantee that something that is half of the values are negative? Well, how do I get those to all be positive? But just multiply it by itself. And that's what I've done. And so we're not squaring, we're not taking the absolute, well, it is, I'm calling it squaring, but we're not, it's not the same as the absolute value, because what is the absolute value if not the square? It's like the square root of the square. That's again this issue with circular definitions, right? Everything is turning on the definition of a measurement, which is also an observation. So observation, that's defined in physics. Measurement, that's defined in math. Okay. But they're sort of alluding towards the same thing. Yeah. So just a thought. So how do I solve this A plus B times C plus D giving us 4 terms? How do I get around that when the Pythagorean theorem only has 2 terms? Well, I don't care. I'm fine with it actually being an expansion, because then I have 3 solutions instead of 1. I don't have to just have the Pythagorean theorem. I can say it's a limit point of this more general theorem, and then just treat the dimensions as operators. And guess what? That's already happening due to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where the position uncertainty and the momentum uncertainty are canonically conjugate. This is in the same notation as that delta x naught, which is why I kept it consistent so that it's aligned with measurement. Because it's super easy to be able to say, well, guess what? I can square it because it can't be negative. And so it's just a question of how do I go from something that might be negative to something that has no chance of being negative? And in this particular approximation, the fastest way is just to times the thing by itself. Now, if I had presupposed a bunch of other axioms that were perfectly reasonable, that's fine. But I'm really looking at presuppose as little as possible. And it really does require this ground up, like actual proof. So my proof is just saying, like, there could be a case where the Pythagorean theorem isn't true, and that would be for a non-stationary object. So this approximation incorporates motion by saying, well, there's a maximum motion, creating an expected deviation, because the substrate, what's responsible for the measurement? I'm not looking in the chat right now, but I hope someone is at least getting the right answer. So that is about it, and really appreciate my mom stopping by to say hi. Yeah. So Daryl says times the duration. There's no such thing as a negative duration. I think what we're getting at is, like, is there such a thing as a negative amount of apples? Not really. Not in the same sense. It's conceivable that there could be an apple debt, but it's not physically the same thing as apples existing. So time is like apples in that sense, that it is. One of the properties of time is that. Now, the confusing thing about time is that it actually has a whole bunch of things that are true about it that on the face of them seem contradictory. So that's why, I'm basically fine with going over these minor issues over and over and over again, because my guess is, how could anybody really get to the point of thinking past the Pythagorean theorem if everything is going to be self-referential, from what I can tell, within the Euclidean axioms? And that doesn't really give any way to not presume anything about parallel or perpendicular. And that's what I really like about this proof, is that there's not really anything presumed. it's just a maximum deviation. It may not actually. Sometimes the point is that sometimes the maximum deviation isn't perpendicular. And if we're restricted to the Pythagorean theorem, then we're just basically presupposing, well, that is always perpendicular. And it's not the case. In entangled systems, it isn't the case. And that's the sort of yet another tricky thing I'll say before wrapping up here is the conceiving of what it means for something to be entangled, because there's always, anytime there's a system, it's entangled. If there's an interference that happens to the system, aka measurement or observation, there's a breaking of that current state of entanglement and then a reassuming of another state of entanglement, because entanglement is just another way of saying superposition. And superposition is really just a distribution, and reality functions in such a way as to accept this distribution as sort of a very broadly simulated distribution of possible states. So yeah, I agree that space and time are absolute values, and that is not inconsistent with my theory, but I don't want to go to the point. See, to me, it wasn't worth it to define an absolute value function versus just keeping the expressions in the absolute simplest form, because right now they're in operator form. If I want to drop them into an absolute value form, I lose all the richness of the operator. Why do I want to do that? Why would it, I love linear algebra. I'm not going to deny myself what it offers computationally just because it may seem on the face of it that certain aspects of my theory contradict current understanding. It's not a fact. It's like saying one dimension contradicts three dimensions. It's not a fact. They have complementary, maybe, strengths in certain domains, but not contradictory. Daryl says, so let's see what Daryl's saying here. People get confused between temporal time and spatial time. We exist in a universe where only spatial time exists, sometimes called space-time. Yeah. So you're saying that when you have a watch, that's spatial time, not temporal time? I don't really take your meaning. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just not really sure what that means. To me, time is bound up in consciousness because consciousness advances with time. So they have to have some sort of dependent arising. I don't know that they're mutually intercompatible given their definitions, that there could be an actual translation, quote unquote, a meaningful translation between them. Because sometimes there's just completely incompatible concepts. If something is a limit of atomism versus an absolute non-dualism, is that compatible? You're kind of stretching. You have to interpret it just to make you sort of force it. And then there's questions about, is it really analogous? Is this accurate? And so forth. So it is funny to hear these like theories that people have about space-time. So I maybe just sort of suggest a couple reframes like, what observables aren't space-temporal? Is there such a thing as an observable that's not space-temporal? What does it mean to observe things non-space-temporally? And so forth. And just, I don't really think time is, we may have to choose between a redefinition of time and just accepting that there's going to be two things that seem like they have different definitions, that operationally they're both time because time has a fractality to it, which is another, fractality is a symmetrical tendency. You can think of it as matter self-organizing as a means of maximizing the energetic distribution, aka maximum dissipation of potential heat energy, aka maximum entropy. 1 year is the length of space that the Earth moves through to orbit the sun. Yeah, I've come to this example several times to show that there is a dependent arising between space and time. Because really, if you're going to talk about this stuff, start with that, because there's past that. Like, if you can't get on the same page about that even just a little bit, the other person isn't reasoning based on the same thing. It's just like I chose 3 plus 1 intentionally so that it would be intuitive, not predictive. That's what it's supposed to be. The highest level is supposed to be maximally intuitive and minimally interpretive. Like I am that which is. That's not saying arguably anything without somebody there to actually interpret it. So absolutely, I'll agree there's a dependent arising between what we're calling space and what we're calling time. However, time has a richness to it that isn't encompassed by space time. And so it's a matter of situational context of what a particular set of definitions mean or set of concepts. I much prefer to go with the concepts because then it's, well, does a word have an actual useful meaning or is it just an intentional semantic obfuscation of ego? It's absolutely expected and not something, to be ashamed of that language would be filled with such niceties because if the first axiom of language is the conveyance of information, the second axiom of language is the strategic withholding of information. And that's why I'm sort of remiss to call something like math language, because what is math hiding? The point of math is uncovering things, maybe the opposite of hiding. Daryl says that time, or aka space-time, is an emergent property of the length of space. Okay, so the amount of matter kind of thing, right? So, because there's a question, where does length actually arise? Is length meaningful? And from studying time, given that time arises separately along the distribution of extant matter, that is actually a measurable effect, aka the Hubble. So it may also be something similar with matter. Just once more, super important thing that I thought of is like words are not specific at all. To get into a process relational framing is how is something true? How is the universe a simulation? Just assuming that, okay, this vague term is touched on something because there's some sort of a non-zero effect on popular culture. Well, how? As in, what's the process relation that could govern a system analogous to the universe that is also describable as a simulation? So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and I hope everyone found my derivation of the Pythagorean theorem to be as fun and interesting as I did. Okay, Daryl's he's still going. Length is a function of the amount of matter and a function of the distance from that mass and the amount of the mass. So again, self-reference. What we're looking for is a justification for assimilation and self-repulsion. Now the question is, can everything be built up based on a model that's just stacking of repulsion attraction? Not just continually self-referentially looping between nebulously understood concepts, actually going to the very heart of the concept. This is a non-trivial question. I think I have an answer to it. But I just want to give my answer. I'd like to see what other people come up with. So, okay, you're saying it's not a self-reference, like I'm basically saying all meaning is degrees of self-reference. So for something not to have a degree of self-reference is like saying, well, a circle can be flat. Well, for a big enough circle, a local approximation, it looks flat. But in my understanding, there's a degree of self-reference invoked at a certain level of reasoning. What constitutes a self-reference, though, is a matter of some interpretation. It's sort of only obvious, maybe in retrospect, what self-reference is. So we have partial understanding of self-reference. And if we give ourselves a chance to learn, we'll get to a more complete understanding of self-reference as a limit of measurement. We'll see you again.